to another episode of Requiem Radio. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances and a bit of sickness that plagues our particular monarchy, specialist, enthusiast even, that is typically, aside from the Democrat, the soy lintel individual you often hear speaking sweet nothings into your microphone. He will not be here. Solo Requiem will not be doing this episode today, but never fear. You have me, the person to steer this conversation of religiosity and conservatism, a Democrat of all things. Ah, yes. I am hoping that all the people at home are rejoice at this moment in time to hear me discuss this episode. And it's an episode, surprisingly enough, about psychology. So what type of psychology in particular? Well, it's a fusion of not only psychology, but religiosity from a graduate who not only has spoken at length to conservatives, but has had his moments in which he was highly regarded for the speech, and it even is on YouTube. So we'll do our best to, when the episode is uploaded to YouTube, to provide you that listening experience there. It's 40 minutes in duration, but in terms of speaking, this person has had a length and has read extremely and extensively into psychology. But in terms of accolades, I would like him to speak at length about this. We have our individual here today, and I appreciate you being with us, Patrick. Can you just delve into not only your expertise in the field of psychology and religiosity, and just a brief overview as to who you are?
Hey, yeah. So I am. Sum up my journey. I was raised kind of non-denominational evangelical Protestant, and raised very conservative, patriot, Tea Party type personality. And then I ended up moving to, I lived in Washington state, not DC, and I moved to Portland, Oregon. And I went to a Protestant Bible college there. And I was there 8 years. The first 4 years I was in the bubble of the Bible college, which is a lot of other conservative, homeschooled, whatever, people, the blind leading the blind in social skills. But I spent the second 4 years living in Portland and getting to know a lot of the interesting, hippie, left-leaning people of all different types that reside there. And it was a very interesting experience because I did come to this point where I realized that there was truth to a lot of things they said. And I think a lot of people, God willing, they go through this phase, but it just hit me that even if their big picture worldview was wrong, they might have a bunch of actually valid things to say. And it didn't have to be black and white. It didn't have to be all or nothing. And I just started from my own life experiences, what many other minds before mine have discovered, that there wasn't really anything good that was going to be done by all or nothing thinking. Just our side are the good guys and your side are the bad guys. And I think at this point, with how polarized, especially people are in America, I think this conversation's now been had a lot. But part of where my interest lies was specifically that not only had I realized that my political upbringing was oversimplified, even though I still agree with a lot of the views that I held then, probably most of them. But I did realize there was a lot of nuance that was missing. But also I went on the journey from kind of non-denom American evangelical Baptist Protestantism to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and experiencing my politics break a bit, how I thought the world worked, and then it broke and it was more complicated. And then experiencing my religious worldview, which is even more important to me, the spiritual fabric of everything, even politics. When that broke, and I realized that all these things I was so sure about, I was so wrong about. And I realized I could just be wrong about anything. This sense that most of the time I was this logical person, and then, sometimes I was in error. It just dawned on me over several years, how wrong I or anyone can be. And so I kind of set out on a personal quest just to understand myself, my own bias, how I could be wrong and closed-minded about things, how I could be open-minded and still be wrong. And so I read several books on the subject. I found the topic is everywhere, basically why we believe what we believe and how our beliefs change. But I got so interested in it. I read several books, and I ended up giving this speech that you're referring to in Spokane, Washington, to the local constitutional party that my parents were connected to. And the speech was basically, it was presented to them as how to convert young people to being constitutional conservatives, which is not something I'd be opposed to. But my focus was really deep down that it was kind of a bipartisan speech, that it was for anyone to realize that they could be wrong about anything, and that if you actually have something to say worth saying, the first step is actually listen to the other person. And so listen to them, understand them, realize that there's probably something true about what they're saying, even if there's a bunch of dangerous errors, like there's probably something true about what they're saying, and then frame what you have to say, including if it's disagreement, frame it in terms of what they care about and the truth of it. And that is highly likely, or relatively, like that is much more likely to change someone's mind. Whereas most of the time what we do is we just like throw a fact or a citation or a statistic or an argument that was convincing enough to us to give us catharsis. But in reality, like a lot of the arguments we use, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'll just say simply, a lot of arguments we use wouldn't change our mind. But after we believe something, the argument sounds really good and makes us feel good about what we already believe. And we don't realize that this is happening. But that's one of the things I studied and was talking about in the speech. So anyways, kind of, I guess the tail end of this story is that around the time I was entering into the Orthodox Church, I gave this speech. And it kind of burnt me out on politics. And I'm not saying that no one should be involved in politics, but I think for me personally, my involvement was not a positive use of my time. It wasn't accomplishing a lot. My speech, despite it being well received and well researched, like it didn't really make any changes. And so I think there are some people out there absolutely who should be involved. But where I was at in my spiritual journey, it was like the perfect situation to remind me, hey, maybe focus on like your own heart and the evil you bring to the universe and healing that. And yeah, and what that became was the coaching practice that I do now. So now I do a fusion of psychology with early Christian spirituality. So a lot of different writings from the first 1,000 years of Christianity, which are a lot more practical than a lot of modern Western Christianity, like very much about looking into the heart and healing and what separates us from God. And it's very personal, rather than like wrathful and legal. But I do this coaching now, and I see kind of that speech as what made me put aside what was my old path and start this new path, which has been very awesome and very actually fulfilling, and feels like I'm actually, making some degree of difference in people's lives. Very small scale, but I mean, it's so much more change than the speech brought. But the thing is, I still love that stuff. I still love studying why we believe what we believe. I read a lot of books on brainwashing, conditioning, cults. There's a lot of patterns in the current woke movement and the LGBT and trans movement, especially. You can see some of these same patterns I was looking at in why people change religions. And I'm realizing some of the same situations and same mental patterns are going on in like why people are succumbing to the woke movement, and especially the transgender stuff. So anyways, that's kind of in a nutshell what I currently do now. I do use some of that political knowledge because I have people that come to me who are, sometimes at one extreme or the other, or they're the person who's in a more center place, and they aren't around anyone who's center like they are. So having someone who can kind of I understand the left's arguments, I understand the right's arguments, and being able to actually integrate that into a coaching practice, I think has actually been a huge positive. So yeah, that's kind of my background and what brings me here. So.
All right. Wow, you gave me an absorbent amount of information to start off with. I think probably the best thing we can get to in terms of the crux of the subject matter is that often enough, we often criticize other people for what they believe, whether that be political, ethical, religious, in means. But normally we often look at what exactly determines it. My belief is typically, and I think I've expressed this on multiple occasions within this podcast itself. However, I think we had a bit of an overlap in terms of a realization you had as well. That primarily being that people, in terms of what they want, generally overlap with one another. That being well-being for themselves, well-being for others, a life of prosperity, as well as good standing and great health for those who are around them. The contention is not in those values, but in the way we go about achieving said value. Ultimately, what occurs typically is that certain avenues that people espouse to, say, utopia society, often for some people begins to result in people disparaging the core principle that he might have. For example, let's go to the most extreme determined. Some people might believe that to get to the highest peaks of society, that some form of eugenics must be involved. Like, let's say, for instance, you believe that life of autism, the extreme cases where you're mute, you're completely suboptimal, essentially someone who has to be caretaken throughout all of your life. Thus, it makes sense for them to believe that if there is a way to determine with absolute certainty that the child could be aborted, that it ought to be aborted. But someone obviously perceiving that value from those like steps up there, you as sociopathic, someone who can roll down the ball to eugenics as racial discrimination, racial supremacy, despite the core tenet of the individual espousing this belief might be just suffrage reduction. So this is something I wanted to ping-pong back to you, not to just derail the conversation in its entirety, but again, I should just initially start this off by asking, what do you think are some of the core tenets of just beliefs in general and why we believe? Something you wanted to expand upon earlier, but I think the floor is to you now. My apologies if this went on extensively. We're going.
No worries. And I mean, I pretty much completely agree with what you were saying too, that it's like, other people have something to say that, you know, it might not be black and white. It might not be everything they're saying is wrong and everything that I'm saying is right. And one of the lessons I've learned is that every single person I meet has something to teach me. And every single view they hold at least is partially reasonable. Now, it doesn't mean it's completely reasonable. It might even be like really evil or something. Like they really actually want to, you know, kill a bunch of children or something like that. But I don't think, and this is partially from my religious worldview, but I don't think anything out there is inherently evil. I think that everything is created good and then is misused. And so we always can find in something the salvageable pieces of what is true and what is good, even if we have to reject some other things in what someone said. And my personal kind of principle is that if I meet someone and they tell me something and I can't salvage something good from it, then I can't criticize them. Now, I'm not going to say I actually follow this rule, but it has stopped me several times because I realized, like, if I cannot find something that's true about their view, I already know I do not really understand their view enough to criticize it. So that's one of the simple lessons I've learned, is just like to assume everyone has something to teach me and has something. Everyone has this is how I usually word it. Everyone has a good reason why they believe what they believe. They could also be wrong. They could also have bad reasons, but there's something in there that's driving them. You know, maybe their grandparent was a Democrat or Republican. Maybe, you know, they witnessed something really awful. Maybe they're just a tender person by nature. I think nature comes in a lot too. But regardless, that's one of the principles. That I was thinking of.
Don't mean to. Sorry if I'm interrupting. I thought.
Go ahead.
I just thought it was interesting what you just said there. Something I thought was well enough or important enough to conversations to be concise as possible is sometimes that can add a bit of perspective and help people out, is understanding that many people might perceive themselves as the main character within the universe. Even when it comes to cruelty or abusive parents, if there was more than one child, they'll still perceive what is occurring as something that is uniquely happening with them. Or there's this weird occurrence in the brain that even when you're having a bad day, what agitates you isn't the occurrence in of itself, but how it's just uniquely happening to you. Like life has selected you to be an anomaly of unfortunate sequence of it brings forth a sense of unfairness. But what can ease this frustration is understanding that it's commonplace rather than perceiving it as some sort of ill the world wishes to do you harm in.
Yeah. Anger is fundamentally, there's something I want, I'm not getting, and if there's something that could be punished, then it would, make this right, or maybe it would even give me what I want. Sadness is like the same thing, except we've kind of accepted it passively. Like, I can't do anything about this thing and I'm unhappy. And anger is like, something has to pay. Maybe I have to pay, but something has to pay. And so, yeah, if we've got that main character complex, and I think to some degree we can't really escape that. Like, to some degree, I'm just me and I'm nobody else. But you can definitely see, I think, to your point, that there's some people where it like overtakes them. Like it's like this gravity where everything almost like is forced into that system. And so, yeah, I think, you could even tie this back in too, because I think the main character syndrome feeds back into kind of, I guess what I could just call a closed-minded system. Like if my worldview is less about the pursuit of truth and it's more about providing me catharsis and comfort, then how much more so is that and a main character perspective going to like reinforce each other in a way? So yeah, that's very interesting. So kind of the main answer to your question, and it's one of those answers that at first it doesn't sound very deep, but as you apply it, you realize it's incredibly profound. In a lot of the situations, we kind of miss what's actually going on. It's the key. But the very simple answer to why we believe what we believe, the simplest way I could word it is familiarity. If you're raised by certain parents and they tell you the truth all the time, you don't end up with a concept that people in the world are liars. Like that there are a ton of people out there who would lie, because what you're familiar with is that most people tell the truth. This is the same with racism, and this is why, that word means like 10 different things depending on who you ask. But like the actual stereotyping of a person, even though on one hand, like I think we should give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Clearly I'm a little bit kumbaya about all this discussion, but it's extremely reasonable that a person has a bad experience with someone with a certain skin color or hair color or worldview multiple times, and then they think that that's going to be a normal thing. That's actually entirely logical, even if it turns out not to be true. And if we don't have that perspective, we're not going to be able to reach people who, maybe actually think all people of a certain ethnicity are like devious and evil, which I'm personally not a big fan of perspectives like that, even though I can flex with a lot of other race stuff, if there's correlations with certain races and genetic factors or whatever. But anyways, whatever is familiar to us is what we believe. And you can see that with anyone who's raised in a certain worldview. Like if they're raised in that worldview, it is a monumental and difficult thing for them to shift to another worldview, because it's so familiar and deeply ingrained with them, ingrained in them. And so most of the time, like if I'm walking down the street, I'm not looking at the ground. I'm making an assumption. I'm assuming that the ground's going to be there. Is it possible that the ground could move, that something could shift, that there could be a hole I didn't see? Sure. But functionally, a vast majority of the time, my familiar knowledge, which is that like 99.99% of the time the sidewalk is there, that's functional. So it's on one hand totally reasonable and normal. We're just going off what's familiar to us. But what we don't realize is that actually has like a major power over us. And so we have to realize, like, if you're someone listening and you're like, I want to be more objective, always keeping in mind the fact that whatever you're familiar with is going to bias you is extremely important. I have to know that, like, if I'm having a discussion with, one of my Catholic friends, like Sola or somebody on Twitter, that my Orthodox perspective I'm biased towards. Like, that doesn't mean I'm wrong or that I'm right. People almost want to treat that like an insult these days, but that just kind of shows how unaware we are of like how extreme our biases are. But deep down, like when we have a conviction, like in the moment we have a conviction that something is true, a lot of times we attribute it to reason and logic. We attribute it to like, oh, I reasoned out this view and came to this conclusion. But there are so many other factors that come in, and familiarity is the big one. Our personality type can be a big one, and I think that's one of the things that people factor in the least. Like, they really fail to factor in. For example, and this is something I talk about in my speech, if you do big five personality assessments, which are, I would argue, I love a lot of personality systems, regardless of if they're scientific, but the big five is one of the only ones that is actually like scientifically rooted. Like, they did proper method and experimentation, and what two traits that the big five came up with, like, that were these very empirically observable traits that tended to vary from person to person, were what were called conscientiousness and openness. And conscientiousness is a personality trait where one likes to protect things. So they end up in the military, they end up conservative, they end up people who take over successful businesses and maintain them for a long time. And then you have this other personality trait that's called openness. And openness is basically the opposite of that. Openness is, I like things to change, I like diversity, I like variety, I like innovation, I like new ideas. And as you can see, this is highly correlated with being left-leaning personality politically. And we can see these personality types like everywhere as we start to look for them. But the reality is assuming all these pieces that I'm putting together that I think make sense really do fit like this, the reality to me on this topic is that these two personality types are supposed to actually talk to each other. Like this conservative personality type and this liberal personality type, or whatever we want to call them, whatever spectrums of politics we want to draw. But these two personality types, when they talk to each other, they actually have like the best ideas. Like, they have this, like, to kind of stereotype, like the conservative says, hey, certain drugs are dangerous for people. We need to legislate them. And if people are doing drugs, we need to have laws that, protect our kids and children and put these people in jail. And then you have the left come along and go, no, these people need compassion. In fact, we should give them meth pipes and all this stuff. And they take, this other extreme view. But when I've looked at research and I've talked with people and I've met people who are former addicts and whatever, the solution that works for them is always is somewhere in the middle. It varies from person to person, but it's something that is hard on them and charitable and merciful. And this is something we see in all of psychology, that the only times people actually grow from being like broken and hurt and traumatized and wounded is when they have that. When they, on one hand, Carl Rogers talks about this, one of my favorite psychologists. Carl Rogers talks about unconditional positive regard, which is something that a therapist has to give to a client. And what it is that the client knows that no matter what they say to the therapist will still regard them well. Now, the therapist might say, what you did was bad. What you did, we need to stop doing. What you did, you need to tell the police that you did. Like, it's not different than, it's not the same thing as approving of what they do. But the therapist is like, yeah, if it turns out, you murdered someone, you need to turn yourself in, whatever, and I will come visit you in jail and be your friend. Like, I will come to you and talk there and be your therapist. I will be there for you. I don't think badly of you. I know we all make mistakes. Like, they're going to take that stance. But they're going to hold them to a standard. A therapist that just goes, oh, that's nice. Like, I love you, so it's okay, whatever you do. We know that's wrong. But we also know like that dad figure that's just so mercilessly hard on us doesn't really help us either. And so anyways, all of this to say, it's amazing how many of these different variables and factors come into why we believe what we believe. And they may be very nuanced and such. And yet we're approaching the topic with, like, I guess I would say, no knowledge that we're not a computer, we're actually a human being. And so is the other person. It's kind of like, here's my blog post of all the things I believe in the arguments, and here's the blog post of things you believe in the arguments. But in reality, like, I'm more than just a collection of views. Like, I have a heart, I have experiences, I have a personality. All of these things affect why I believe. And I may not even be aware of how they're affecting what I believe, which means that it's on us, if we're talking to someone else, sometimes, to figure out why they believe what they believe. They may not even realize it. And as we talk to them, we go, oh, okay, I get it. They're really worried about this. So if you want to change minds, figure out what the other person deep down is truly concerned about. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, that when it comes to politics, like, it's amazing how many of the values we actually all share. Like, most of us don't want to see innocent people die. Most people want to see kids protected, but it's actually the solutions that we disagree on. So if we approach the conversations assuming there's nothing we can agree on, we're definitely going to shoot ourselves in the foot. And even if the other person was open-minded and we were correct, and if we presented our view well, they would have listened. We're now at fault for the reason that they didn't have their mind changed, not them. Not because they were closed-minded, but because we didn't do our due diligence to actually, treat the other person like they're worth investing time in. Like, if we kind of just treat them like we can take them or leave them, but we expect them to, like, unhinge their whole trailer of worldview from their truck, that's kind of contradictory. That doesn't make sense. Like, I say one argument, you don't agree after the argument, I say, wow, you're so close-minded. It's like, you didn't invest anything. Why do you expect them to invest their whole entire worldview on one argument you made? So anyways, yeah, clearly I can go on and on about this, but that's a couple key points that I've learned from my studies. So
Yes, I believe that like openness to an effect does affect leftist beliefs and ideologies in terms of progression and understanding what can be accepted within the Overton window. I think most people believe it in terms of what harm is caused by the progression and acceptance of what it means to be an adult. For example, for the longest period of time, I think that here's the thing. When we talk about sex operation, transgenderism, I'm more of the basis of determining the white matter formulation in the body. I am holistically, I'll bite the bullet and say I'm a transmolecularist by most descriptions of it. I believe that if you were to argue by any capacity that it is bigotry, a discrimination of intrinsic belief, intrinsic characteristics, then it cannot be simply as malleable as a social construction or a label. It has to be something incidental, individual in question. It cannot simply just be a matter of social parliament or entitlement. It cannot be simply a descriptor. That is possibly the biggest aspect of. So if that requires that I might be labeled as a transmolecularist. Okay, Shelby. Suffice it to say, I do believe that when it comes to those levels of progression, there is a core tenet of these people have the cognizance of. I believe that there's a exceptional age range of adulthood where you can make sense decisions. Usually they reflexively are like within 18, 20 age range, but development of the brain just step into 25. But relatively, we want them to be on the cusp of like adulthood, of making all exceptional, while your most emotional states are your teenage years, where decisions that might feel permanent in the immediate proximity to your livelihood, your friends, or academic field, you'll probably look back at that person that was a teenager and be unrecognizable as to who. This is all to say, to wrap up all this, is that I get what you're saying in terms of core values, and even conservatism speaks to this, because it sometimes, I think one thing that's great about communal respect, such as church, is that it offshores a bunch of gigantic questions as to what it means to live in society. What you have to do in terms of long living in prosperity, getting married. It answers the existential question of what is the soul goal in terms of expiration. You no longer have to deal with that daunting and horrifying thought of permanence within reality. And so these things are offshored in a way where there's a comfort in understanding these aspects, where I can understand as to why a conservative would want to have and to provide this assurance to a multitude of people, whereas now they can focus on things that are more physical, just in the immediate proximity of the communion and people around them. These are two different exceptional reasons to espouse and believe these values. So sometimes people butt heads on the other particulars, but I think I'm just bringing up those are excellent reasons why people believe these things. These are exceptional reasons, and so the unwillingness to acknowledge that definitely holds people back from having conversations as they were. But I also believe, and I'll just leave this nugget for later in the conversation, but I also believe that sometimes, I think, at least in terms of my personal beliefs on it, I think sometimes people's unwillingness to be forthcoming, and that could be a condition of them being ostracized, condemned, maybe witch hunted, being forthcoming about their belief. And so, for me personally, I am not that judgmental. However, I would like for us to be honest actors when conversing with one another and not simply have a multitude of implications transpire throughout the conversation. And whenever I acknowledge them, I'm treated as a schizo from acknowledging the clear implications of your own language. But the following thing about this conversation, since we're based upon about how do we change minds, I think it was interesting since that was how do we affect that in common parlance in having those conversations. I think that transparency is often a good way to handle this, but what way do you think a best maneuver for people who might not have a psychology degree?
Yeah, I touched on it a bit earlier, and that's gonna, I would argue that the first practical step is like making a very large effort to actually understand the other person, and to realize that understanding is probably a higher bar than like reading a book, although that's probably good too. I mean, if you're going to argue with Calvinists and Lutherans, you probably should read some Calvin and Luther. If you're going to argue with communists, you should probably read some Marx. But a lot of times understanding is like actual experience. And I find that if I want to dig a bit, as I said earlier, a lot of us, we don't realize even why we believe things. Like we really genuinely, all of us, at least some things, we don't actually understand why we maybe most things. But if I encounter someone who is like really, really big on a certain view that they hold, a lot of times what I will ask them is if they're, and this is where, you know, the politics and psychology overlap. I'll usually ask, do you feel like there's anything else in your life that resonates with this value? I might not ask that question because it sounds a little goofy, but like I might ask them if like, have you had any bad experiences with drugs or something like that? Because a lot of times you'll find out, oh yeah, I had this bad experience in the past. And it's like, okay, cool. This makes a lot more sense. One of my, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying comparatively, building your point, sometimes somebody who, let's say, want to be a hardline conservative in terms of espousing the beliefs of stay-at-home mothers, and they're expressing these beliefs, and they also believe that women have no part and no place in political movements. However, I think that cripples and stifles the movement's effectiveness in reach. Since if there's no speaking female figures, no one to espouse how, well, great of an experience this is, there might be a narrower view of people who will be willing to entertain it, considering there is no one on your side that happens to be a woman who seems to advocate for the position to be one that is advantageous for common people. So, just building off of what you're saying,
yeah, there's a lot of different variables that can come in for sure, and I've had to. Sometimes I will. Oh, how do I put this? I will say I think. So the way I've spoken about it is kind of like, you know, in the charitable, I like to call it kumbaya to make fun of it, even though I'm like that personality. I'm a peace, try and make peace and reconcile with people, and, you know, bear the insult rather than like insulting back or something. If I can, I fail at this, but this is the goal at least. But on the other hand, I'm also a big believer that the knowledge of the other person's view is also the most effective way to dismantle it. And that was my experience living in Portland. Was like roughly half the time they were like changing my mind and convincing me, and the other half of the time, as I would hear their arguments and I understood them, it would very naturally occur to me that there was a contradiction with some other view they had or argument. And I wouldn't be able to show that internal contradiction if I didn't actually listen. So listening is just as much about like being charitable and showing love to the other person and blah, 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 which are all things I believe in, as it is about also, if their view turns out to be wrong, you are now an expert at dismantling it. But the number of times I have heard in my life people like go read a Wikipedia article and then come up with all these arguments, and the people who hold the view that they're arguing with are like, you can't, you know, you've got a straw man, you can't even represent us. I can count on my hand just in the number of times I've seen that in like the last week on Twitter. And I've done it quite a lot too. So it's very key to listen, both so that we can be, you know, good conversationalist and hear other people, but also because a lot of times it's the very key by which you break down the lies that someone believes. So, for example, a great example of this that just I can think of a bunch, but one that pops in my mind from Jordan Peterson. I got things I like and dislike about him, but he makes this really good argument at one point when he's talking about how some of the current activists will talk about how intersectionality, that's what they call it, where this experience of being a Black woman is very unique, and if you're not Black, you don't know what it's like to be Black. There's a little truth to that. I think they gatekeep with it in a way that is ridiculous, but there's a little truth. You don't understand what it's like to be someone else. And the transactional people, intersectionality people will point out that being a woman is this unique experience that you don't understand if you're a man or whatever. But then they make this really big emphasis that if you are Black and a woman, that the sum is different than the total of the parts. That being a Black woman isn't just the experience of being Black and being a woman. It's like more advanced. It has new attributes that don't happen in either Blackness or womanness. And there's truth to this. There's totally truth to this. They've turned this into a ridiculous weapon, but there's absolutely truth to it. But one of the things that Jordan Peterson pointed out was that if you follow this model, you can keep adding things. You're not just Black and a woman, you're also an American. And you're not just a Black American woman, you're also diabetic. And you're not just a Black American diabetic woman, you're also this. And the list goes on infinitely until you realize that the whole intersectionality thing is actually kind of self-defeating. Like every single human being is basically logically their own unique set of experiences. And it's like, once you say that, it's like, well, duh. Like we kind of already know that. But intersectionality, is used as this weapon just to go like one or two steps in. When in reality, if you understand what the arguments are, you can show the absurdity of it because it defeats itself. But if you don't actually listen to it, then you're still I'm going to say conservative boomer just quoting all these like memes you saw on Facebook that really are terrible arguments. But when you actually listen, you acquire the inside knowledge of the view that is actually the most effective way to dismantle it from within. So I'm a big believer in every situation you approach it both and. I could be wrong. They could be wrong. We both could be wrong. We both could be right. Maybe we're just misunderstanding each other. I don't know when I go into a conversation, even if I think I do, all of these little details. And so the more we can operate, and this is another principle that's broader, but certainly applies here. The more we can operate with a beginner's mind, the more effective we'll be. And the beginner's mind is the idea that everything you do, don't presume you're an expert. Presume that this is your first time. Now, I don't mean that literally, but I think you get anyone listening gets the spirit of it. Like the idea that there's nothing that I approach that I'm like, oh yeah, I can just do this really flippantly. Like I already know, like this person's a Lutheran. I know Lutherans. Like, no, every person is their own person. And you actually have to put in the sacrifice and effort to understand them if you're actually wanting to change their mind. And I think that's one of the biggest things that really frustrated me into writing that speech was that I kept seeing people complain, but they wouldn't put any effort into actually understanding what they were complaining about. They just wanted to complain and they wanted it to go away. And some of them would be activists and would start political movements and whatever. But I was just always in awe that the fact that many times they could not state for you the views of the other person or the people that they were disagreeing with in a way that those people would say, yes, that's my view. Like they couldn't steel man the argument. And to me, if you're going to be a leader, an expert, like if you're a leader, you should be an expert. If you're going to be a leader and an expert on this enemy movement that you're opposing, you should be able to steel man their argument. Like that kind of should be a given. You should be able to steel man the argument of something that you are going to make an effort to go after. Now, if you're just some guy on Twitter who's sharing some arguments, that's a little different. But if you're going to be, a conservative leader, or you're going to have a YouTube channel about some apologetic subject or whatever it is, you should be able to steel man it. That should just be a given, that you deeply understand the view that you're going after. And unfortunately, I think most of the time we don't realize we've not done that. Like when I say that, it makes sense. It's like, oh yeah, that's totally logical. Like, yeah, we all agree. But then I go and look at like my posts from the last month on Twitter. Did I actually do that? Sometimes. So yeah, it can be a hot mess. Trying to not only navigate the complexities of the other person, but the complexities of myself. And I always think there's the Garfield meme that goes around that says, "You are not immune to propaganda." And again, most of us see that meme and are like, "Oh, yeah, I know those people." And hopefully we say, "Oh yeah, me too." But in practice, we it's like not something that we ever take into account. Wait, am I being brainwashed? Am I being conditioned? Am I biased? Am I able to actually listen? Am I, like having extreme emotional reactions to this question someone asked me, so I can't really answer it objectively? Like we just kind of react. And so I think there's this call in our pursuit of being, good people. And of course, we might have like small differences, but as you said, most of us here, like even if we disagree, we probably have a lot in common. But for this basic idea of being a good person, approaching all things as if I don't know this person, I can't judge them, I can't put them in a box. I'm going to actually have to put effort into knowing them and understanding them if I want to actually do something productive here. And if I'm not willing to do that, maybe I shouldn't engage at all. Like, you're allowed to say, I really don't feel like having this conversation with someone. But if you're going to do that, maybe don't trigger them and walk away. Because what's going to happen is you're going to say this one statement, they're not going to understand it entirely, and they're going to sit and mull over that until the next time you bring it up, and they're going to I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where you say something to someone, you don't realize it stuck with them, and then a month, a year later, you run into them or whatever, you're having a discussion, and you realize that they've been thinking about this statement the whole time. And my dad did this with orthodoxy once, where he was just like I said one statement about orthodoxy to him, didn't even think about it, whatever. And then 3 months later, he's sitting at the dinner table and we're having this little conversation about faith and whatever. And he goes, "Well, that doesn't make sense because this one time you told me X. And I just can't believe that. How could Christians believe that?" And I hear him say this, and it occurs to me, oh, he's been thinking about this for months. And he didn't understand what I meant when I said that. He doesn't understand the theology behind it. So of course he's confused by it and really concerned. But anyways, all of that to say, the tact that we should have if we are people that say, I don't want to just debate about stuff. I don't want to just argue with strangers on the internet and have podcasts. If I want to actually make it different, I'm going to have to bleed and sweat. And I'm going to have to be humbled. And I'm going to have to sometimes admit I'm wrong. And I'm going to actually have to treat my enemies like humans, like human beings who I actually value as much as the political arguments that I'm making. And one of the most important skills I've ever learned in all the time I've had discussions about religion and especially politics is this, and hopefully someone listening could go away and maybe put this to use, because it's helped me a lot. And I've given this to some of my clients to help them defuse situations. But if I have someone who comes to me and they're really, like you said, Hazy, we share some same values. The only reason I could talk to this person is because ideally we both care about human beings and their well-being. We might disagree on the details, but ideally we both agree on that. But so they're coming to me and they're like, yeah, how could you disagree on the trans stuff? People are committing suicide out there and all this stuff. And they start getting angry and whatever and blah, blah, blah. And eventually I'll get to this point where I kind of take a breath and I look at them or look at the screen and type into my keyboard based on the circumstance. I look at them and it works better in person, but I'll usually say hey, you and I are having this conversation because we care about people. I know you care about people and that's why you're having this debate. And I care about people. And I want to have good policies that help people. And I can tell you do too. That's why we're having this debate. But the way you're talking to me is like I'm not a human being. You're talking to me like I'm a fool, like I'm an idiot, like I'm hateful, whatever. You're just treating me really badly. And the problem is if you're trying to convince me that your argument is all about people and their well-being and you're worried about them being suicidal and being hurt and whatever, but you're willing to treat me like this, I have a hard time believing you. The proof is in the pudding. All this abstract doesn't mean anything if I'm right here in front of you and you're treating me like I'm mud, like I'm dirt, like I'm disgusting. I've straight up said to people a couple times, if you want to prove to me that your political views are driven by a real care for humans, treat me like a human being. And yeah, it's worked. I mean, it hasn't changed minds, but it's at least got people to pause and actually be quiet, because I've not found many things that will quiet like zealot political person of any view down. But that's usually it. Usually that will make them realize like they're kind of being dumb. Like whether you're yelling at me or saying I'm some monster or people like you shouldn't be allowed, whatever. Like, yeah, I've had to use that at times. So anyways, yeah, there's a bunch of thoughts for you. So
Yes, thank you. I think something that plays into said a bit earlier about people's thoughts, even let's delve into the notion of suicidality. Some people might believe that just opposing Jews. I'm on the side opposite of this. I'm really a trans advocate, but I have to be a trans about something physical, something that best way to describe it as an anomaly, something that occurs within the brain, something visible and tangible and observable. And I don't believe that there is any other way to describe it other than like this has to be the core tenets of what you believe. However, someone could say, why do you presume, who might be on the opposite end of this, why do you presume that my methods, or what I desire, couldn't be with that in mind? Avenue that I'm aspiring to couldn't ensure or desire to ensure that self-harm does not come to this individual. And that's the prescription of malice or evil that often comes to people talking about these subject matter. As well as when we talk about intersectionality, I do believe that there is a good case for it, especially due to some sort of unique anomalies, such as, well, how Black women are some of the growing populations, the highest growing populations of entrepreneurs, but they don't have the same amount of financial support, which if we could do something about that, I think we ought to ensure that people, I think in terms of how society functions, we should do everything possible for the people that are capable and trying to ensure that they have all the supports they need to do well. This is the same thing with people grants for colleges. If we notice people will have aptitude for an ability to aspire and achieve, then we should do everything to assure that occurs. That is my core principle with that. However, sometimes intersectionality becomes a game of inaccessibility, a game in which all these experiences are lapped onto each other, divorce you the ability of invoking empathy. That there is no way you could consciously recognize what I'm experiencing and what I'm describing. Therefore, I am the sole authority and arbiter of what I'm describing and saying to you, ultimately resulting in, therefore, do as I say. There is no capacity in which you can challenge what I'm discussing and describing to you. The room has a chair, but you can't go in the room with the chair in it.
That's a huge problem, and it's another one of those ones where we need like balance. We need that balance between extremes, because of course it is true that when we haven't experienced something, as I said earlier, we have a harder time understanding it. But the idea that that's like, boom, so you have no comprehension at all. It's like, no, if I've been sad about one thing, I have some semblance of an understanding of what it's like to be sad about other things. So the truth of it, I think the rational response is to be humble and to give more weight to the person with experience. But this idea that it like closes off other people from conversation is absurd. Like it just doesn't, there's no proof for it. There's no logical argument. But I experienced the same thing when I was in my conservative Bible college, because I would hear all these opinions about like romantic relationships, like, oh, this is how you should date and this is how marriages should work and whatever. And I was like, why is everyone like disagreeing over this? Isn't there research on this? Like, there's got to be people out there who went and like studied marriages and looked at which ones were more successful based on these criteria that everyone's debating about. And so I went into the basement of our Bible college and to their like psychology and relationship counseling, marriage counseling section. And there were a ton of books on how to fix your marriage now that it hasn't worked out. But there were only a handful on like being a wise, healthy person and picking a good spouse before the marriage. But I read a bunch of those books. By a bunch, I mean, I read like 4 of them and I skimmed a handful. But I would tell people at my Bible college about what I've been studying this research and it all says blah, blah, blah. And they did not like what I was saying. It was basically like, it was more nuance. And so So put yourself in their shoes. There's some, dude, girl that is an evangelical who's watched way too many Disney movies, and everything in evangelicalism is basically about getting married, especially for a girl in her 20s. Everything is about how everything's about marriage, and marriage is going to solve all your problems, and every Christian, God wants to get married, and if you're not married, you don't get to be in ministry. The evangelical world when you're single is kind of rough. And so they're in that position, and they hear me come along and say, basically the research said that the more you have in common with someone, the more positive things you have in common, the more likely it is for your relationship to work out. People have the arguments of opposites attract, birds of a feather flock together. And basically, if you have differences, that's totally fine. It's not like it's bad to have differences, but you want someone who you do have, relative to the rest of the human population, a lot of things in common with. And you also don't want to look for complementing. Most of the time we look for someone to be different than us, we're usually compensating in some way. It's not natural. In marriage, you want someone to bond with, to understand you. That's a key part of marriage. And so a spouse who you have nothing in common with, you're not going to be able to make decisions together on the practical level, and you're going to have a lot less understanding of each other on the personal level. And so the research on this makes sense to me. There's a ton of studies that back this up. Really, this isn't really a disputed topic among anyone who has done research. But when I mentioned this, these people in the Bible college world, it's already hard enough to find find a spouse who is godly and who I'm attracted to and whatever. And now here's this guy who's coming along and telling me they also have to have similarities and stuff. And so they would always get really annoyed and just shut the conversation down real quick. But the number one argument they always used was that I'm single, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But the problem was that most of the time they were single, and I'm not citing my own authority. I'm citing marriage counselors who are not only have seen thousands of marriages, but are usually married themselves. The authors of the books I read were all married. So it's they have all the reason that you should listen to them. But the mere fact that I, the messenger, am not experienced means that they don't have to listen to what I'm saying at all. Instant rationalization to shut down the source of cognitive dissonance. But yeah, so it was really weird seeing a totally different world, rather than political, current, I try not to always call it woke, but a lot of the woke movement, and then at the same time, this conservative, slightly Baptist world, this same idea of weaponizing the valid authority of experience to an invalid reason to just shut down anyone who disagrees with you. But yeah, unfortunately, we see the exact same thing in politics right now. So yeah, very, very sad phenomenon, very blatant logical fallacy, but oh Lord have mercy, we are where we are.
The interesting thing about how what we can do to be more objective, I find that a good way to understand a lot of what we're describing here, to try to remove ourselves from the equation a bit and our personal reservations in the pursuit of a more charitable conversation. I think that is always an admirable goal when it comes to those subject matters. But we also you also spoke a little bit about manipulation in the ways such as cults, consumerism, and woke. When you speak about manipulation, one of my favorite questions and inquiries I often come to is, what do you mean when you say manipulation exactly? And you describe these things.
Oh, that's a
what does
question.
It mean to be manipulated?
Yeah. I think, okay, this off the cuff, I'm just picking something off the cuff, but I think this would work. Manipulation is going to be someone getting you to do something that if they told you directly and honestly what they wanted and what their intentions were, you wouldn't do it. Or vice versa, trying to get you to stop something that you wouldn't stop if you do. So basically, it's something is veiled, something is dishonest, something is not authentic. Like me and my friends, we just know each other. I know what's in my friends' hearts. They tell me, I see their weaknesses, I see their strengths, etc. If they say, sometimes even if they are dishonest, I know them well enough so I know what's actually going on. Hey, could you do this for me? Oh, I can tell that this thing's bothering them again. They just didn't, want to say it out loud. So like the world of honesty and virtue, etc., is one of vulnerability and transparency. And so the world of manipulation is getting people to do things you want them to do for reasons other than the ones that are your actual reasons. So I would have to think for a while to get that in a good succinct sentence, but I think that's kind of clear what I mean. So everything from the corrupt religious leader and cult leader to the narcissist dad or the narcissist mom, saying, compliments and stuff, but the compliments aren't because you actually feel love for the other person. The compliments because you want them to do something. Boom, manipulation. So that's one of the things, and this is kind of its own this could go off into a big tangent of its own. But the simple version is that was something that drew me to the early Christians, because I was raised with the Christianity where doubt is a sin. And not just a sin, but like you're in spiritual danger if you don't have like perfect belief that God is real and that he exists. And so like I'm a skeptic by nature. I question and doubting. I question myself, which I think is the line between a good skeptic and a bad skeptic is skeptical of everyone except themselves. They're conveniently skeptic. A good skeptic is skeptical of everything consistently, including oneself. But I'm a skeptic by nature. And I'm a big believer that if someone is sincerely doubting, they should be allowed to question. Like if someone doubts me, I like on Twitter, I'll tell people like, hey, if you think something I posted is weird or you are like not sure, like come talk to me, tell me, maybe you'll be right. Maybe you'll protect me by criticizing me. I don't know. But we're open to that. There is a value. I'm very aware there is a value to chain of command. There is a value to not constantly questioning, because I've doubted to the point that I like drove myself insane, just like doubting reality itself. But there's a degree to which doubting and questioning is good. And George MacDonald, he was a Protestant theologian who deeply influenced C.S. Lewis. He has this quote that I really love. He says, "Thou doubtest because thou lovest the truth." And in historical Christianity, that was actually a thing. If you read a lot of the early Christians writing about, for example, the Apostle Thomas, I was raised with, we always use this phrase that was very insulting to him, was doubting Thomas. Like, you're a doubting Thomas who, when Christ was resurrected from the dead, you wouldn't believe in him unless you had proof. And that was always this like negative thing that I was raised with. And then I'm reading the early Christians and they're like, Thomas doubts because he wants the truth. And so his doubt is holy. And it actually says in the early Christian hymns, the holy doubt of Thomas. And I was like, whoa, there's this whole Christian world that's actually more historical, that actually celebrates sincere doubt. Like, obviously, they don't want you to just doubt for the sake of it, because, I mean, if any one of us is in a friendship and we just start doubting randomly, we know that hurts the friendship. So it's not good for us to do it. But if we need to, if we feel convicted, I'm confused, I'm unsure, I'm questioning, and it's sincere, there's no shame in that. And so I was deeply moved by the fact that was something that was tolerable. But I think tying this all together, one of the big signs of manipulation for me is the creating systems that oppose questioning. So, the simplest one is, if you doubt, you go to hell. Boom. That makes people less likely to leave your group. That's a good way to control them and keep them in and manipulate them. And so a non-manipulative thing would be, hey, here's true reasons why you should do this. But, I'm a fallible human. I could be wrong. I can't judge your heart if you stop believing what you and I currently believe now and you go somewhere else. That would be honest. That would be non-manipulative. That would be open. And so manipulative would be using other methods. The greatest one, this is a footnote, but maybe one of the more interesting things, in my opinion, that I've said this whole time. At least it was very interesting when I learned about it. I like studying. I have books here, and I sent you guys some screenshots and pictures before we did this chat, but I really love reading books on cults and manipulation, how governments manipulate, how we blind ourselves. Like, clearly this is a subject I love. And one of the things, of all the things I've learned, one of the things that just was a wow moment was I was listening to one of my former Mormon friends, talk about something they were told while they were a Mormon. And, no offense to, if you have any Mormon listeners or anything, and I don't think all Mormons say this, thankfully. Not honing in on the Mormons, but I think this specific thing that was said to them was like it was top tier 5-dimensional chess manipulation. Like I was in awe. Like I was impressed with it as much as I was horrified. Basically, so we have this part of us. I would say God gives us this faculty, which is cognitive dissonance. We have a part of us one step deeper. That's our. Sorry, I'm outlining here, and I'm realizing I have to go a little deeper first. So, part of being a human is meaning. We need meaning. Why that is, well, that could be its own whole, 10, 20 episode podcast series. Why we need meaning, evolutionary perspectives, different religious ones, etc. But it's clear that we need it, and it's like empirically and psychologically observable that so much of what humans do is about meaning. Watching movies and telling stories is about meaning. When we're in pain, we go, why? Why did this happen? Like pain is a triggers our meaning seeking system. And so meaning is so basic to us, like that the things we do are purposeful and connected to bigger purposes. And we get a high when like someone answers a question, which is another reason we join cults, because if a cult leader can just make us feel like there's answers to everything, that's very, very appeasing, because we really need our meaning machine fulfilled. So as part of our what I would call our meaning machine, we take our experiences and we kind of sort them into the meaning machine. That's part of what logic and reason are for, is like I have some experience and then I try and understand it, like sort it into like, okay, what was that? I saw a bunch of lights. What were they? Well, the lights were actually the sun reflecting off a car, and the car just drove by. Now, most of us like immediately we just go, oh, a car just drove by. But we don't realize like that's actually what's kind of happening in most situations. And so we're kind of interpreting. But then we're doing a deeper kind of interpreting, which is meaning. It's not just like what, it's not the what, it's the why. It's like this whole deeper layer of metaphysics and philosophy and reality and psychology, whatever, is the why. We really need whys behind things. It's a very spiritual reality, in my opinion. But we can be wrong. That's the simple version. We could be wrong. We could be wrong about anything. And so we have this one system that kicks in that's cognitive dissonance. And that's when two things are in our head that seem to be true, but they don't fit together with each other. And that really bothers us. In fact, and this is something that's in my speech, they've scanned the brains of people when they were basically challenging their political view. And the brain lights up very similar to being tortured. Like it is a experience of pain that is like torture in some way, to have your meaning system, your worldview challenged. And we don't realize that this is what's happening to us. This is what's happening to other people. But this system of cognitive dissonance is this huge red flag that it's like, this isn't how meaning works. This isn't how truth works. Truth can't be like this. These two views, those can't coexist. Either you've got to reconcile them, or at least one of them is wrong. Like that's what the feeling of cognitive dissonance, that's what stirs it, because we know that that's not how reality works. And so we can't handle it. Denial like really unhinges the human mind. And so going back to the Mormons, and this one specific Mormon thing, normally if I was trying to get you not to question, get to manipulate you, to condition you, brainwash, whatever word we want to use, if I want to manipulate you not to leave my cult, not to leave my group or my political party, whatever it is, the simple version is the best version is I can use truth. I can say, hey, here are the real arguments. I can also try and be a decent person, because I think that's part of truth too, is to truly be human, which I think a true human is a loving person. I think an evil human is actually not true to human nature. Kind of the opposite of modern Christianity. I think that sin is the most unnatural thing that's ever happened to a human. And so I think love is what we're built for. I personally don't think that we can fully love without the help of God, but I do think that we have some of it, and it's definitely what we're built for, and it's definitely the best way to have these kinds of conversations. But normally if I actually love people, I'm going to use truth, and I'm going to be a loving person. Now, maybe if I want to get a little manipulative, then I might use something that's a little less honest or skips the truth step. And I say something like, if you leave this group, you're actually contributing to the suicide of tons of people by changing your political view, which I I think that you can appeal to that kind of stuff, but I think like weaponizing it as a form of argument is not good. Like the truth should be enough in itself, I believe. And if it's not, then don't talk to that person anyways. But anyways, like that's how you would normally manipulate. But what this Mormon friend of mine was told was that when the other person says something and you get that really uncomfortable feeling that what they're saying contradicts something you believe, and it gets really uncomfortable. What they were told was that feeling is a sign from the Holy Spirit that the other person is lying to you. When I heard this, I sat there with it for a second, and I realized it is one of the most genius brainwashing techniques, conditioning, manipulation, whatever we will call it. Brainwashing is a buzzword, but I mean, still an effective word. But I've heard few methods that are as effective as this. And the reason is because normally you would just be try and keep them away from questioning. That's what the shame does, or the fear of hell, or whatever it is. Like you're causing death, so you're going to go to hell because you left the religion, or what. Like that's normally what you would do. But this is better. And the reason this is better is because you actually take the system that breaks you out of lies, which is cognitive dissonance. It breaks you out of lies. Like you might believe something that's false. Someone tells you some fact that you can't argue with. And from that fact or collection of facts, you realize that this view you had is wrong. Like that's what cognitive dissonance does. It's a step in that process. But what that lie does, that the Holy Spirit is revealing to the other person's lying, what that does is it actually takes cognitive dissonance and it actually makes it a feedback loop. That's the term I want. It's a feedback loop. So they first of all, you don't want to feel cognitive dissonance. Any one of us who has really been honest about it knows that when we believe something and someone says some well, there's this church, for me, for example, well, there's this church father that says this positive thing about the Pope. That's what me and my Catholic friends argue about. And they have some great quote, some proof text from the fathers. I get cognitive dissonance. That's uncomfortable. Like immediately, what's my brain doing? You can guess. Anyone listening can guess. I'm like, okay, is there another quote that disproves this one? Or is there context that makes it actually align up with my beliefs and orthodoxy? This is what we all do. All our brains immediately are going to start doing that. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think what's wrong is that we don't admit that we do it and that we aren't aware, and that it's almost like something we try and ignore because it feels like it would discredit us. But instead, what people who believe this teaching from certain Mormon circles, what this does is it actually makes that system that breaks you out of lies. It not only it's normally you're trying to disable that system. Like the fear of hell is something to disable that so you don't have to face it. But this is stronger. Like I said, it actually feeds back into it. So you're sitting there, the other person says something about how, Joseph Smith was blah, 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 your Mormon prophet, and you don't like what they said. You're naturally going to feel really, really uncomfortable. And you're going to be like, oh, this is weird. I've never heard of this. Oh, what's the rebuttal to this? Oh, I believe in Joseph Smith, so it can't be true. But I've never heard this. That's how you're going to feel in that moment. But then it comes to your mind, oh, this means they're lying to me. I feel extremely uncomfortable. And then, boom, what actually happens in the brain. And again, this is another thing that I talk about at the beginning parts of the speech, which that we've been talking about. Healing the political divide is what it's called. One of the things that we've studied is that when you have cognitive dissonance and it's alleviated, it actually releases a hit of dopamine. And what this suggests, actually, here, I'll just go through that little study real quick. So basically what they did is they got a ton of people together, or a ton of people for this study. And what they would do is they would hook the person's brain up to a MRI machine or some kind of machine to scan activity in the brain. And then they would do 3 steps. The first thing they would do is they would ask each person, what are some of your favorite politicians? And then they would have prepared quotes, real quotes from that politician for this exercise. And they would pick one of the people that the person said they liked. And what they would do, say it's Bill Clinton. This person likes Bill Clinton. And so they happen to have prepared some quotes from Bill Clinton for this exercise. So what they do, they've got their brain hooked up to this scanner. And the first thing they do is they read a positive, simple quote from Bill Clinton about something he believes or values or something he wants to do. And the person reads it and they're like, yeah, that's a great quote. I agree with that. Like, he's Bill Clinton. I would agree with him on that. It's the kind of view he would hold and why I like him. And then they will show the person another real quote that just at least sounds like it blatantly contradicts that one. Like, it just gives the person cognitive dissonance. Like, it's a clear flip-flop. 1 minute he said he supported gay marriage, and then here's him at this other event saying that he doesn't support it at all and that it shouldn't be legal in America or whatever it is. Like, that sort of thing. And that's when they noticed in the brain scanners that consistently, when they did that, the person's brain would light up like they were being tortured. Like, the way the brain lights up is very similar. And that's not like extremely scientific, things unrelated can light up similar parts of the brain, but it does say something. Like the areas, the regions that are lit up are very similar, pain centers, etc. And then what they would do after that, and you can see this kind of ties in a bunch of points I've been talking about. The third thing they would do after they gave the person cognitive dissonance is they would give them an explanation that reconciles the two quotes and makes it make total sense. And that was when they found, not only, as you would guess, the pain went away, the pain of cognitive dissonance went away. I mean, that's what I do. If someone tells me some challenging thing I've never heard before, I go Google it. And then when I find out that, the quote was fake or there was nuance missing, I feel so much better. I feel that feeling when you've had I don't know if other people get this. I assume it's out there, but when you get a brain freeze and then it goes away, it actually feels really pleasurable. And that's one of the things about pain, and it's one of the things they use in like BDSM stuff, like that the alleviation of pain is actually releases dopamine. And so that's they found that in this situation, that when they showed the third quote that alleviated the cognitive dissonance, not only did the pain centers stop acting out, but they actually found the release of dopamine in the brain, that the neurotransmitters were actually increasing, the neurochemicals. And dopamine is what's released when you take cocaine. Like, dopamine is tied to addiction. It's just extreme. It's a chemical tied to something being extremely pleasurable. And it's also the fact that when we experience something that releases dopamine, we are much more likely to engage in that thing. And I think we can just throw the neuroscience talk out and just say, if you like something, you're more likely to do it again. And if it feels good, you'll want to repeat it. Like, it's that simple. So what this kind of points to, on a separate note, is that having your worldview validated is actually very likely extremely addictive. And I think we can observe this. I think we can observe this in ourselves. I think we can observe it in other people, in humanity as a whole. I don't think it's a partisan issue. It's a human issue. But we'll surround ourselves not only with data. Like, I think that's a little understandable. If you're like, oh, this movement or that movement I don't think is good. You want to surround yourself with data to back that up and to research it. That totally makes sense. But we like to surround ourselves with like the talking heads. Like, we'll join some political group chat where people will say things that we believe and we just like it because they're just saying it. Like, they're just saying, yeah, those Pope splainers, or those neocons or whatever. Like, we just like hearing people say that stuff. And the reality is it's giving us dopamine. Every person who says what we want to hear and makes us feel connected to other people that have views that we have, and we don't feel alone in the world, like, that releases dopamine. And there's not something inherently wrong with that, but we need to be very cautious about it. And so, but this is going back to the Mormon thing. This is the same thing that's going on there, is that if you not only have the person not following the cognitive dissonance and the evidence that challenges them, you not only have the incentive to use cognitive dissonance as an argument to reinforce your own view, but then you also have the release of dopamine, most likely in those situations, simply through the thing you tell yourself. Like, if you are worried that someone else is challenging your view, and then immediately you can alleviate all that by going, oh, I have that really intense, uncomfortable feeling. They're lying. You very likely get a hit of dopamine right then. And then what do you want? You want more Mormon apologetics to tell you how right you are. So anyways, I can kind of wrap up that train of thought there. But I think we don't realize how how prevalent these manipulative techniques are. I mean, I think, and also that we do it to ourselves. Like, I think we don't realize we're doing this to ourselves all the time. We're picking things in our lives that condition us. And once again, for the third time, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We can't escape it. That was something that freaked me out when I first started studying this stuff, was like, oh my gosh, Orthodox people will do stuff that's like looks like what cults do. And then I was like, oh, politics groups will do this stuff. And then I started to realize, oh, you can't really escape being conditioned. All you can do is choose what you're conditioned by. Like, every billboard you look at conditions you. Every time you eat the same meal or you order the same thing on a menu, you're conditioning yourself. Every time you pick which friend you're going to be around, you're conditioning yourself. But I think the bigger question then becomes, what are you going to be conditioned by? And also, and this is something I look for particularly, is the conditioning honest? And a good example of why that's important, one of my friends in Portland, one of my pansexual friends, would go out dancing at 80s nights with me and everything, and was one of those people that was like a genuinely open person, but would also explain to me in my own terms the kind of leftist Portlander views. And so I loved hanging out with them, and they came with me to my Orthodox church one time when I first started going. And they noted that, they weren't, I don't think they weren't being judgmental or anything like that, but they were just honest that, like, the part where we said the creed was kind of uncomfortable because it was very much that, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. And she could feel, it's like it's a room full of people chanting this. Like, she could feel that this was like some glue that was holding these people together and conditioning them and forming what they believed. So we were having a conversation about this later. And what I told her is, I said, yeah, I said, I totally understand that. I kind of felt the same way. And you're not wrong. This is exactly what's happening. I said, but what you don't realize is that every time you listen to music with lyrics, every time you see an ad, the same thing is being done to you. But when you're at my church, it's obvious. It's obvious that we're all standing here chanting these words that we want to wash our brains with. Whereas when you go out in this capitalist society, and I'm using that term very neutrally, but when you go out in this consumerist society, the same thing is happening to you, except now you don't know it. Is that actually worse, or is that actually better or worse? Personally, I would rather choose the conditioning that is honest and obvious about what it's doing versus all these ads and commercials that act like, oh, I'm just a friend trying to tell you about really sexy chocolate. No, you're a business trying to convince me to buy this chocolate. Like, it is, marketing is to some degree manipulation. And you can go, there's a book called Cigarette Century. It's this really great history book about the history of cigarettes. And cigarettes are basically, like, if you're talking about MK Ultra, you're talking about the CIA, whatever you want to talk about, that's about like brainwashing and all this stuff. When you're talking about the cigarettes, you're actually talking about the origins, because a lot of the guys that helped the cigarette companies come up with their manipulative advertising techniques went on to be some of the authors and psychologists and researchers that the CIA and other government agencies ended up using. So this is actually some of the discoveries of this belief. I call it belief psychology, just as like the umbrella term, but belief psychology as a weapon, and as manipulation. And so obviously, I mean, people have always been manipulating since the dawn of time, but or as long as people think they've been around. But it's very much something that a principle I would say is that you can't avoid being conditioned, but we can be honest that we're constantly being conditioned and be mindful about what we let condition us. That's another big lesson I've learned from studying belief psychology. So, yeah.
I always enjoy guests with this extensively about particular ideas. We talked about manipulation. Obviously, to suffice my opinions on it, is that I think sometimes manipulation, often the notion of a secondary operative that is existing within the ultimate goal, but isn't prevailing within the primary motivator for behavior or action. So let's say, for instance, somebody describes to you the joys and loves of, let's just use cigarettes since it's already been spoke about. Somebody who describes cigarettes, they talk about they talk about beaches, parties at night, summertime. However, the primary of that the addictive nature of it, the nicotine aspect of it, the cigarettes provide you nicotine, that it creates some relaxation, but it's also an addictive aspect of it. But the advertisement, the motivations of it all are so far removed from the actual one-to-one motivator for purchasing the product. And to that extent, that is manipulative. I think that's apropos. I think a lot of what you described there is extremely salient. So one of the things I thought wasn't just get down to it. I think another thing I wanted to just touch on, sorry, I thought this was worthwhile. You brought up a myriad of things I thought were worthwhile discussing, and we'll perhaps at another point in time, perhaps even a follow-up episode, we'll discuss it. But I thought it was worth bringing up that obviously there's a discomfort and comes from cognitive dissonance, where we have to figure out how do we figure that out? How do we can find out the contradictions, we can remove the person outright from a circle of influence, or say, and I've seen this happen many times in Republican groups, how there's like hypocrisy on the other side. Do I believe in rule of law? Yes, but it is the leftists who do not believe in rule of law. So ultimately, they're acknowledging the hypocrisy of the behavior, but by prescribing that the other group is doing equally what they're describing here. So the admittance of hypocrisy comes with an alleviation of the opposition is either just as bad or has conditioned you to take the narrative without your wanting to, or the initial desire to. That's another thing that's brought up. So just wanted to touch on those two talking points.
Yeah, that's some good points. And this ties into some degree, and I'm bringing it up mostly just because I think it's very relevant to the topic. But I think one of the big problems, I mean, this could be a huge can of worms. I mean, not that it has to be a lot of talking, but someone could want to debate a bunch on it or something. But the simple version is that in the modern Western world, which can be cliche and overused term, but I think in this case it's fair. In the modern Western world, I would argue that we generally have a really bad understanding of knowledge, like as what it is, especially as human beings. And I say this first of all rooted in, and I think this issue leads to a lot of the other issues here. Like this is like one of the more primal issues that leads to all the other little issues being talked about. So Jonathan Pageau, who a lot of people probably know, big Orthodox iconographer, does videos with Jordan Peterson and a lot of other YouTube personalities. He talks a lot on symbolism. That's his big thing, icons and symbolism and how the symbolic world actually works. And one of the things he notes is that the reason symbolism is so ancient and so key is because it's actually human. Like when a person talks about grass, the first source of knowledge of what grass is not a science book that tells you, oh, grass is made out of this element and that element, and it has these mechanisms and photosynthesis. The first experience of grass is you're an infant and you're crawling in it. Like that's what grass is for a human first. Crawling in it, standing in it, sitting on it, grass allergies, putting a blanket on it and having a picnic, grass mowed, like mowing the grass. These are human experiences more directly. And then indirectly, we have these, useful but secondary systems of like science and these very abstract things. And this is something Pageau talks about all the time, is that like he's having to teach people to look at their experience first. And it's not like some revolutionary thing. It's just because, simply put, like all knowledge comes from experience. And that's something that in the West, like is some people listening are like, oh yeah, totally. And some people listening are like, oh my gosh, what? No, there's other sources of knowledge. But the problem is that we tend to have just this like cookie cutter, like cut out my current existence. And then where is all the things I know coming from? But I think what people have to do is they have to actually rewind all the way back to when they were a baby. Like when a baby comes out of the womb, they don't have what the modern West calls knowledge. Like they don't have things they don't even have language, let alone do they have like statements of fact and proofs and stuff like that. Like they just come out of the womb, and whatever systems God has given them, or evolution, or whatever perspective people have, this still works. Whatever systems they have, such as language and music and all these different systems, a conscience, meaning machine and cognitive dissonance, like these things have to already be there. And then they start actively working. So like a baby comes out of the womb and it wants mom. That's built into it. It's not just this object. Like it has all these systems in it that attaches to other human beings and attaches to the mother. And when it comes out, those are the first systems active. The highest knowledge it has is actually this pure experience of a bond with another human who loves them. They don't conceptualize it. They don't even have concepts. They don't have like love, mother, all these things that we have. We take them for granted because we've used them so long. All my life, I've had the word mom as long as I can remember. So to me, mom didn't come from an experience. It came from like existing knowledge in my head. But the truth is that knowledge in my head got there at some point from an experience I had. First, I was a baby alive, and all these lights are going into my eyes. And then after a little while, I start to organize the lights with my reasoning ability. It's not like conscious reasoning, but it starts to become that color pattern is actually my mom, not just a bunch of lights. That's actually mom. I see those colors again. I see that face. I'm programmed to recognize faces as an infant. And so we start recognizing these things, and then we hear other humans go, mama. Maybe you're a little infant and your dad is saying, mama. And after a while, you realize every time he makes that sound with his mouth, it's a reference, it's a symbol, it's an icon. It's a symbolic representation of the actual figure that I really like. Like, I like this lady. And of course, I have to use words to describe all this. You wouldn't have any of these words. But you just know that there's this favor in your heart towards this one being that comes to you. But after a while, you can start associating, oh, when the Dada says mama, he's talking about the mama. I love the mama. And I love the Dada too. And like, that's how the baby is thinking. It doesn't have these words. It doesn't have this ordering of things. It's not linear thoughts. It's so primal. And this is where knowledge actually starts. And then as time goes on, we've used this knowledge over and over and over and over and over again until it just feels like it's a given. And in most ancient cultures, I mean, you can read the Greek philosophers and they think kind of like this. You can read the Buddhists, they definitely think about like this, and the Hindus definitely think about this. Today we call it Eastern, but what's funny is it's actually most cultures in all of human history until the Western world saw that first you experienced things, and then you conceptualized what you'd experienced, and then you ordered with reason and language the concepts that represented your experience. That is how most of human history had understood human knowledge. What has happened in the West is that human linear knowledge, like the kind of thing, like when I say truth, if you said truth to, say, a church father, they're thinking first of Christ, secondly of Christ's will. Like if I'm a true human, that means I am according to Christ's will. So it's a lower level of truth. Then below that is truth just being reality as it is. So, if I'm sinful, that's part of the truth. Even though I'm not a true human when I'm sinful, it is true that I have this reality in me. And then the lowest version of truth would be a statement on paper. Yes, I, Thaddeus Patrick, am a sinner. And unfortunately, what's happened is that this whole hierarchy has inverted. And in the modern West, the highest idea of truth is a statement. And if you can put it on a statement, that is it a true or false statement? And I think all that stuff is useful. We should think about truth in this way, but we also need to realize it's also deeper than this. That's actually a simplified system to measure deeper ideas and experiences that we have. And again, we all kind of know this, but then the next thing we're doing the word concept fallacy, where we think that, if the same word is used, it must always literally mean the same thing. And all of these problems are fruits of kind of being in the Western world, being in the world of, I wish Solo was here so I wasn't swinging at nobody, but I do think the Catholic Church is a lot to blame, because the first spiritual teacher I've ever found to think that human reasoning was as high as an authority was Thomas Aquinas. I can't find any church fathers that think like that. St. Augustine doesn't think like that, even though he's a very logical person. But Aquinas himself, and this is an actual quote, if anyone listening wants this quote so they don't feel like I'm just slandering their saint, and I actually do like Aquinas, but he himself said, man does not encounter God directly like the angels do. Man can only reason up to him. And the Orthodox spirituality and the early church father spirituality was all about encountering him directly. And their whole deal was like, no, you can experience him directly. And if you don't, you haven't really entered into the depths of Christianity yet. But that, I bring that up because the Catholic Church had a huge influence on what became Western culture. Even Protestantism, as much as it disagrees with Catholicism, compared to Orthodoxy, actually has a tremendous amount in common with Catholicism. Like the way they think about God, the way that the reformers, Calvin and Luther, used reason and logic was very much in a way similar to Aquinas when he was writing his book. And you can see in a lot of the Western theology, reason becomes this way higher position than it had before. Like the fathers talk about it. They call it dianoia. It's the Greek word for like linear discursive reasoning. But they don't consider that like a primary way you know God. That's related to the nous, N-O-U-S. It's the center of the heart, and it's like the spiritual experiential faculty. And just to make this concept a little clearer, my first Orthodox priest, the metaphor he gave was very simple. He said, when the sun hits your skin and you feel the heat and you have this actual experience of the sun hitting your skin, that's related to the nous. And that is that, along with what you see with your eyes, are the first forms of understanding you have about what the sun is too. And then after you have this experience of the sun hitting your skin, you use logic, and you also have emotions. You use logic, you might say, oh, I read about this is the sun 98 million miles away, and it hits your skin with these rays of light that carry heat in them somehow. That's where you enter into reason. And then emotions are either like, oh, this feels really nice, or ow, that's hot, that hurts. But these are reactions to the deeper knowledge, which is the encounter with the thing. And this is the same reason why there is no experience of technology that will ever be the equivalent of a human being present. Like there is something about human beings that is mystical and divine, that they can't just be treated like particles. Even people that claim human beings are just particles do not treat human beings like particles. They have not faced David Hume's is-ought problem. But there's the way human, kind of circling back here, but the way human knowledge actually works is first we spiritually encounter realities, or mystically or deeply. I mean, someone could argue it's science, and I could concede that just for the sake of the discussion. But it is the deepest part of our experience for sure. I think that when you really pay attention to the little details of how you learn about things and go through life, that this becomes self-evident, that you experience things first, and then you remember them, and the memory is never as accurate as the experience. And so you have this memory or concept, and then you represent what you experienced and conceptualize with words. And so we can see the layers of fallibility. But what happens in the West a lot of the time is we do presuppositional apologetics. We just start with a presupposition and go from there. And I don't think that's bad, but I want to ask, where did that presupposition come from? And I think that's what you're studying when you're studying belief psychology. Another way to word it is that phenomenology precedes epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Phenomenology is the study of consciousness. And I think we oftentimes in the West don't realize, like, phenomenology is actually first. Like, you experience things. And the person, and now we're kind of getting a little bit back to that intersectionality discussion. But the truth is if you haven't experienced something, now I'm going to be on their side on accident. But if you haven't experienced something, you don't understand it. And if you partially understand it, that's because you had an experience that had something partially in common. I do believe that. I do believe that is literally like black and white truth. Like, what you don't experience, you can't understand. The error that I was pointing to earlier is that you have had some of the pieces of the experience. So like I said, someone might be sad about something different than you are. And to that degree, you don't understand them. But to the degree that you're sad about, you lost a job and this other person's sad because they were in a breakup, like to some degree, you do understand each other. So just to alleviate any cognitive dissonance for people about what I said earlier. But yeah, that is, I think that is actually a very important key. And one other way this ties into the whole rest of the discussion here is specifically on the topic of how do we change other people's minds? And I think this is a very big point to answer that I just thankfully accidentally set up to bring up this point too. But one of the very big points I think from all of this in how to change other people's minds is you have to give them an experience. And this can be in a lot of different ways. For us Orthodox, we believe that the change in ourselves is the experience that we give other people. That, we can argue day and night about who's right and wrong about, whether it's atheism and Christianity or Catholicism and Orthodoxy, whatever it is. And I think those discussions are worth having. But in the end, the most compelling thing is Orthodoxy specifically claims to transform people. It claims to make them have a kind of love that is beyond normal love. Now, if any one of us claims we have this, then by our own standards, we would say that's a clear sign they don't. Such people are humble and don't think highly of themselves. But our whole religion is very an empirical claim that there is this level of love that is available through the religion. And that's why we point to our saints as like real people, that there are these kinds of people today. You can go meet them and they have this love that is otherworldly, that there's nothing else like it. I never saw it. I've never seen it anywhere else. That's why I was convinced. I tasted and saw.
Speaking about that unique experience of love, just curious, I don't mean to add into going down, but I was curious about religiosity and how you with therapeutic sessions. Something I do believe we should speak about within the confines of the podcast. I don't mean to, because I enjoy this conversation thoroughly, but I do wish to have that something for the love a little bit after you're done that.
Yeah, I'll transition to that. And I know Sola and I talked about doing that subject as like its own episode too, but I can definitely start into it like a little bit, like the basics of it. So kind of finishing this trail of thought, just kind of wrapping it up. Oh my gosh, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
I didn't mean to stop your thought. I just wanted we touch upon it for the podcast, just to make sure that I had forgotten about it, so I wanted to ensure myself. But yes, you were just talking about the unique love of religiosity.
And the idea that we have to give someone an experience. Like for us Orthodox, the response, and I'm using this just as like an example on this point, but for us Orthodox, like our number one quote unquote argument is our work we do on ourselves. And we take that to such an extreme that if someone else, like if say we have a friend who inquires into Orthodoxy and then doesn't become Orthodox, we are encouraged to emphasize us. Like, Lord, I'm not perfect. And to be clear, I do not mean beating yourself up. That's actually something that the early church writers said was not good. Like saying, hey, I'm flawed, Lord, I need your help. I'm sad about that I keep doing these wrong things. That's good. But being like, oh my gosh, I'm so sinful and I'll never, like, I'm the worst, blah, blah, blah. Like that sort of thing isn't at all the same. And that I actually would say is very damaging. But that's a side point. But the main point being that the experience is the most compelling thing when we're trying to change other people's minds. And, sometimes maybe an example would be this. You meet someone meets you who has bad experiences with people of your political persuasion. And then you treat them really well and you treat them kindly and you actually listen to them and you are different than all those people that came before. They will tell you, wow, you're not like those other ones. You're different. And in fact, it'll shock people to win them over. Like if they've met bad Christians and then you're a really gentle one, or if they've met woke people who are really arguing whatever, and you're someone who believes in, intersectionality and all these different movements and how important they are. and that will sway you. Like just to have someone treat you well and listen to you, and you will be biased towards them. So I could probably generate like a ton of other examples given enough time, but that's what convinces people the most. Like if they think that everyone from a certain country is evil, and then they meet someone from that country and that person is actually really kind and loving and sacrificial. And by loving, I don't mean like nice. I mean actually cares about you, actually will sacrifice for your well-being. And so that kind of person changes your mind. And I think a lot of us have probably had this experience. I certainly have, where you meet someone from some group you don't like, and then they're actually kind and they're actually reasonable. Same with me growing up with Christians who were like shamed out. And then I experienced this other totally different kind of Christian that was not afraid of my doubt, that was not afraid of me asking questions, that was like bold and actually seemed kind of secure in themselves. And so, yeah, so this could be applied a lot of different ways. But if you meet someone and you want to change their mind, which, you know, we can't be too attached to that, but I think at its core, it's noble to want to change minds towards something we believe is actually good. Giving them a better experience, making what they experience along with the view is as important, maybe more important than the view. And we almost have to be careful, because now we're entering into a place where we could actually be manipulative. But I do think it works because I guess I could just say because it makes sense. Like when we can observe this in people, when their worldview is truly satisfying, or when their view on something small, it could be a small scale, like their diet, like I eat this one food. When it's truly satisfying and it works, a person tends to have peace about it. And when it doesn't work, people tend to be really defensive. This is why I would argue, from my perspective, some of the current LGBT movement is so uppity, because I don't think it's actually addressing the trauma and hurt and things going on in their hearts. And, you know, if someone disagrees, that's totally fine. I know Orthodox Christians that get defensive too, so that would be a totally fair pushback. But I think that phenomenon in general is observable. So when we meet people who actually can keep their peace, and my patron, Elder Thaddeus, talks about this a lot. When we meet people who we realize, like, you could insult them and they will still love you, like, that is actually a really good argument for their worldview. And not just from the perspective of like, oh, I like being around nice people and they're nice, so maybe I want to be in a worldview that's nice. But like, worldviews produce people. They affect people. Whether we want them to or not, they affect us. And so it actually is a logical conclusion that if you meet someone who has good attributes, that you wonder about if what they believe might have some influence on that. So anyways, that's kind of the wrapping that point up. But yeah, I can talk a bit about religion, and specifically Orthodox Christianity, from a therapy perspective, how those integrate together. Let's see. So yeah, let's cover just a brief version of my own journey then, because I think that kind of illustrates everything, what I do now, and how some of this works. So I was extremely, so we're shifting gears hard here. I was extremely depressed growing up. I was very unhappy. I did not like being alive. I got to my Bible college after being mostly homeschooled. I went to school one day a week, and it kind of got worse, which I realized later was actually partially because I had gut problems I didn't know about at the time, and I was eating this highly processed cafeteria food. But I had no idea what was wrong with me. I thought maybe I'm not thankful enough, maybe I'm not a good enough Christian. I went to a couple therapists that were the school therapists that you could go see for free. One of them was helpful, and the other ones I saw were not. So I had some experience with some bad evangelical Christianese therapists, which I think has been a very positive thing today, because I know what things not to say, because they were said to me and they did more harm than good. But I was just miserable. I did not like being alive. I did not understand two things, and this kind of goes to what triggered you to ask me about this, the concept of love. Two things bothered me. One was the lack of altruism in the world, and in myself especially. I could tell there was this part of me that was hungry to be unconditionally loved. Like I wanted people to love me, even if I was flawed. That unconditional positive regard that Carl Rogers talks about that I mentioned earlier. Like even psychologists have observed this. We want this so badly. And I also think we do want to give it to other people. And part of this is shown by the fact that we want other people to think we're like this. We want other people to think we're nice and altruistic, or that we like, maybe not nice, maybe the other end of the spectrum, that I'm a fighter, that I fight for people and I stand up for people. Like we want people to think that we're loving. I think that deep down, every human being, they want to be unconditionally loved and they want to unconditionally love others. But all I can say for sure, because this is all I have experience with, is that I wanted that. And I remember being, kind of in mainstream evangelical Bible college. I mean, they had a lot of different groups. They had Calvinists and Lutherans, Lutheran theology there and stuff. And they had Pentecostals and all different kinds of Christians. But it was mostly it was like non-denom, Baptist, evangelical, whatever, rock show, worship, and everyone there was very big on like, go out and serve people and do serving things for people, and they called that love, and that's totally biblical. I think it's appropriate to call like loving deeds loving. But one thing I always noticed was that we all liked it. Like it felt good. It felt really good to do nice things for other people and to feel like, wow, I really used my time to help that homeless person. Henry Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, he writes this little short story, only writing I've read of his, but I loved it. It's called Bartleby the Scrivener. And at one point, one of the characters is talking about how like they do a nice thing for someone and it would feel good at first, and then the person doesn't thank them and now they're irritated at them, and then they see the smile on the person's face and now they feel so much better, but then the person they remember, they still didn't thank them and now they feel worse. And he calls it the tiny morsel of conscience you get when you do a good deed. It's like this little cupcake you get to eat because you did something nice for someone. And I read that while I was in Bible college in my English class, and it really hit me square in the face, because I was like, we're not actually being loving. Like, I'm not going to say there's no love at all, but like if we do a nice thing for someone and they forget to thank us, or they do something we don't like, it goes out the window. Like I'll do a nice deed for someone and then they go, oh, thanks. And then they walk away and now I'm irritated at them. And it's, this questions would arise in me. Like, what is this actually love? Like, is it love to be conditional like this? It doesn't seem like it's supposed to be, but I don't know how to stop. Like and there was kind of all these different debates. Like some of the evangelicals I was around would say like, well, maybe selfishness actually is part of God's design and it is natural to us. And that starts down that Ayn Randian road of like functional selfishness, where we're all selfish, but we do it in this like functional and well-aligned and well-ordered way, and then it all works. But something in me just never found that to be appealing at all. And one of the ways that stood out the most to me was that when you look at stories, anyone who lives in the selfish way, even if it's like functional selfishness, they still end up being like the villain in a lot of stories. Whereas the hero in the classic archetypal story is the person who, on one hand, is entirely secure in themselves, or to some degree is secure in themselves, and from that security freely gives and unconditionally. And those are some of our favorite heroes. They're like, maybe they were villains and they turned good. Maybe they're, something is really hard for them to give and they don't want to, but they give it. Sometimes they give to a person who's going to hate them and they give anyways. And it's like that to us is like such an amazing hero. One of the best examples list to me, at least when it hit me the most, was when I watched The Dark Knight for the first time. And I had always thought, if you're the hero, you sacrifice a lot, but at least everyone knows you're the hero. But the end of this movie is Batman lets everyone, not only do things not go how he wants. He wants to encourage Gotham, and instead this horrible thing that happened is so discouraging. But he lets everyone blame him for it so that they don't get discouraged. So not only is he the hero, but everyone he's the hero to is going to hate him for what was actually a good deed. And I realized, like, oh my gosh, there's levels of love. I remember watching that movie and being like, there's levels of love I never imagined. Like, I thought, you get rewarded for love, but real love is like, you get nothing. You made the universe better and you get nothing. That's closer to what real love is. And I think deep down we know this. We see it in the greatest heroes in our stories, and I think something wants this, but I know I do, and I know I'm extremely far from it. And so that was one of the dilemmas that I wrestled with. Like, it feels like there's supposed to be altruism in the universe, and yet I can't find it. And the other thing go ahead.
You're saying that true love is without self-interest?
Yeah.
Okay. Just that's to be divorced of any personal gain or acknowledgement of good.
Well, and I think it becomes an absurd concept if it's like you literally can't get something out of it. But it's more that it is not your motive, and it is not conditional on that in any way. Like, if you do something for someone that's really nice and they say thank you and you feel good, it's not like it makes it sinful or it's not loving. It's more that when it doesn't go how you want, it reveals that it wasn't loving in the first place. Like, love is a state of the heart in relationship towards something else. That it's. I mean, ultimately, I believe love is like divine. Like, it is God himself to some degree, which is why we only have the seeds of love unless we have God. That's one of the epistles of John in the scriptures say this. He who knows love knows God, and he who does not know love does not know God. Like, it's very literal. So to some degree, I believe that. But the reality is you're shooting for a state of the heart. It's not like, do I get something out of it or not? It's more, did I ask that question? Like, that's closer to what the issue is. If I do something for someone and I get something out of it, that doesn't mean I'm not loving. I think these holy saints that I love, I think that their heart was filled with joy through some of the good things they did for people. But I think when those things didn't fill them with joy, they had the same exact reaction. They would live a life that the only purpose of it was for other people and for God, to love him and to love everyone else and to love creation, to love the animals and everything. And it was irregardless of circumstances. If they went and fed someone and the person hugged them or spit upon them, their response, they still loved them. That's more aligned with what I'm talking about. So it doesn't mean they're not loving if the homeless person they fed chooses not to spit on them and they actually enjoyed it. But when they do spit on them, it does reveal the state of their heart. And so I think that's closer to what love actually is, or at least how I conceptualize it. So,
right. And when it comes to religious faith and how it intermingles with therapy, are you about mostly endowing the patients with that love of how to take upon it on an everyday basis, or how does it intersplice average day? Or is it just about alleviating whatever problem, like trying in that particular moment? I mean, you can go about the way about primarily what is the methodology when intersplice these two aspects into what is the core endowment was to give to people who you work with? Yeah,
I'll drop the second point I was going to get to. I'm just going to drop my story and just kind of get right to your question. The second point was going to be about suffering and why God lets us suffer. So if anyone wants to message me online or something about that, I can elaborate there. But
run into the problem of evil then.
that's why I'm even hesitant to bring up that point, because that could be a whole episode.
We did an episode on that, funny enough, where we got one person from every major world religion to have a roundtable discussion on it. I thought that was pretty unique.
Heck yeah, that's awesome. Yeah,
people in the podcast. I just got in here. I have a really bad cold and it really hurts to talk. So apologies for not joining sooner. Hope you guys been enjoying yourselves though.
Yeah, no worries. I was just sick last week, which is why we rescheduled. So yeah. Going back to your question, what it actually looks like. So the people that come to me, I'm open to meeting with anyone. Like, if someone wanted, like, some people just like how I speak and explore ideas, and I promise I talk a lot less when it's a therapy session. But I'd be open to anyone meeting with me. And I have some people that I regularly talk with all the time that are not paid clients or anything, but almost everyone that's come to me so far has been some kind of Christian. So, some Catholic, some Protestant, some all different kinds of seeking. Actually, I did have a client who was Mormon, which I personally consider further away from Christian. Obviously, I think Orthodoxy is the fullness of Christianity, and I don't think Catholicism and Protestantism are. But at the same time, I certainly have a closeness and brotherhood to them that I don't have with Mormons, to put that simply. But I did have a Mormon client, so I realized I was stretching my own claims by my own standards there. But generally, most people that come to me are some form of Christian. And at the heart, and I've just asked myself in my head, at the heart, I don't think my therapy would work with Mormonism. I think some Mormons would like what I say, but I don't think they'd realize that it contradicts, like the very claims I'm making don't make sense as a Mormon to practice. But anyways, a lot of times what I end up doing is, so someone will, the model is different for everyone. I really do have a variety of ways I engage depending on the client. Some people with marriage problems, but I think the number one theme is that theme of suffering. So someone comes to me and, maybe they have something going on in their life. Maybe they have a conflict or a breakup or something. And I think, just by nature, one of the basic things we would do is just think about the situation, which sounds really simple. But I mean, if you have a conflict with someone and you're telling one of your friend's going to tell you, oh, have you tried this? Or have you looked at this? Or they're going to ask questions to try and understand it better or help you understand it better. So of course I'm going to do basic stuff like that. That's just coaching, friendship, whatever you call it. But I'm a critical thinker. So I think that I can do that pretty well, even though our friends can do that sometimes. A lot of times, actually, most of the time, our friends are the ones that are this role for us. But once we dive into it more, and maybe I'll bring in some psychology or some personality types or something that brings a little insight to the situation. I'll try and help them. Oh, well, maybe this person's doing this because of that. And it helps us be a little merciful and patient on difficult people. But at some point, what it often comes to is that question of why stuff happens to us. Why did this happen? And that's actually something that I encourage my clients to ask. And I'm going to say probably, if you ask 50% of my clients, they're like, I don't remember them talking about this, because it's not relevant to everyone. But it is very common. I would say probably half of them at some point we talk about this. But I will tell them, I encourage you to ask why this happened. In the world I grew up in, I was encouraged not to ask why. Any doubt or questioning whatsoever is a sin, evangelicals. And that wasn't all of them. That was just some of them, but it was enough to do harm. But having grown up in that world, I actually encourage my clients a lot of times to ask why this happened. Ask, and they're Christians. I say, ask why God would allow this to happen. And that's a heavy question. That's a hard question. And it's one that I say often, anyone who has a easy, simple answer to the problem of suffering is doing it an unexaggeratable disservice. It is, suffering and pain are sacred. Even if there's some reasons that we think are goofy, I'm of the belief that anyone suffering, it matters. Even a baby crying over something dumb. And it doesn't mean I have to treat it as some super special thing now. But if it's suffering, it's in some way, it's something really actually hurting in us. So I tend to treat all of it as very sacred. But sorry, losing my train of thought here again. Why? Asking why, that's right. I will encourage people to ask why. Because I do think that historically, Christianity had this extremely deep understanding of, one, what keeps us from God. If the original Christian claim, and this is where Mormonism doesn't quite work, is that man is meant to be, I'm borrowing the words of, I think it's St. Justin Popovich, but basically, man is meant to be God-made. Man is made in the image of God, which does not mean that he is exactly the same as God, but that there is this special connection that man has to God, this closeness and this intimacy that not only is it's good for him and he should do that, it's part of his design and his existence. Just as much as you having a liver and a spleen and an appendix and a brain, and all this stuff is part of what makes you a human. The original design of man was also that a key piece was God himself being present in man's heart. And what happens in the garden is that it's not quite rebellion so much as independent. It's not like Adam and Eve are like, God, we want to take over. But when the devil tells Eve, hey, like, isn't this fruit look good and like pleasing for knowledge and good for eating? The problem isn't that she thinks or that she has her own thoughts. The problem is that she doesn't co-think with God. It's not so much that she should have been like, oh, I shouldn't make decisions. God should make them all for me. No, God wants us to be free. That's like the whole reason we have free will. But he wants us to be his friend and co-think with him. In the same way that spouses should consult each other for big decisions. That's more the relationship that God wants with us. And so once we're operating independently, we're trying to guess and figure out how to use the world to fill the empty, hungry void in us. Like, we all want something, and we all debate and discuss and change our minds over what it is. And we want women, and we want food, and we want success, we want men, whatever it is. But what a lot of human beings, I think, throughout existence have reported is it seems like we need something deeper. Like there's a deeper piece that's missing. And so I believe that we do have a deeper piece missing, and I believe that that piece is God. And when God is not there in our hearts, having this dialogue with us, Scripture says to pray without ceasing. We should actually be in this state of constant dialogue with God. This is what a lot of the monks on Mount Athos are talking about, that they reach this state where they're praying in their heart 24/7, even while they're talking to other people. But we're supposed to be in this state of 24/7 communion with God, constantly his friend and his bride, as Scripture talks about it. And if we were in that relationship, in all situations, we would know what to do. We would have a pretty good opinion that is formed by our friendship with God, but we would also be able to talk to him. And so we would have this constant flow of guidance. But when he's not there in our hearts, we are really hungry for him. And if we don't know him, then we're just looking at everything in creation around us in our immediate circumstances, what's most familiar, going back to that theme earlier, what's most familiar, and going, how can this please me? How can this please me? And it's usually in the form of whatever the desires are that God puts on our hearts. So God makes me, for example, and this is the way I would talk a little bit with certain clients. God makes me someone who wants to be married, and maybe that's his plan for me, and he makes me so I want to get married. But here I am, say say somewhere down the road at 40, I'm going to become a Christian, and then I'm going to get married. But here I am at 20, and I'm lonely. And what am I supposed to do? Well, I asked a couple girls out, they said no. Okay, cool. Well, I'm still lonely. How am I supposed to fill this loneliness? And I kind of feel like I want sexuality too. Oh, well, on my computer, there's these pictures that make me feel like really good. And I get all that feeling of like being close to a woman when I fantasize about it. And so boom, next thing we know, we're on pornography. And then the next thing you know, we're mistreating women like we expect them to let us choke them and do all this awful stuff to them because we saw that in the video. And then no girl wants to date us, and then we're miserable. But now we can't quit this thing. And we're so attached to it, and it's the only way we feel good, even though it actually makes us feel awful. But we can't stop going back to it. And the fathers talk about this. I mean, you can talk about this as addiction. Like, this is what addiction is. I go to something that makes me feel good, and now I can't function without that thing making me feel good at all. And we like to blame it on neurochemicals, but I think that's kind of silly Western scientism, reductionism. Like the chemicals are you just following what's happening, but they're not causational necessarily. Your body doesn't go, oh, I'm gonna feel happy, so I'm gonna shoot myself with the happy chemicals. Like, you have something that is related to meaning going on, and the physical things in your body align to those, whatever we want to call them, spiritual, metaphysical realities or whatever. But you're not just a bunch of particle dominoes going off.
Hey, Thad?
Yeah.
Sorry to cut in. I'm not sure if Hazy already asked you this question, but did you touch at all on the origins of psychology and how it's like very materialistically based and like a physicalist approach?
No, not at all.
I'm only asking because I'm studying psychology in college, and I'm trying to be a psychiatrist, and that's something I noticed, especially in the writings of Freud and a few other of the pioneers of psychology, they're very atheist, like heavily determinist leaning in their approach. Besides, of course, outliers like Jung, and that's why controversial take. I like Jung's work a lot. But would you want to elaborate that? Would you say it's just like a reason for that being, or because I feel like a lot of criticisms, and this is purely from a Catholic approach here. I'm not speaking on behalf of like Eastern Orthodoxy or Protestantism, but I know for Catholics, a lot of them are very hesitant to the idea of going to a therapist or a psychologist because they see that approach as being very lacking of like spiritual awareness. And exactly like you said, it deduces it down to just chemicals, like, oh, you're feeling bad because you have a chemical imbalance. And they don't ever touch on like spiritual issues going on in your life at all.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say you should quit that program. Don't look at psychology anymore. It's all cringe. Anyone that deals in psychology is cringe, so it's just a rule. But
yeah, I feel you. Gotta do it to get that degree.
I think you kind of start at science, because science is, I think real science is very Christian, very godly. Real science is just the observation of God's creation. And I personally think that God likes when we understand his creation. The same thing as if I make something, I like when my friends want to know about it. I think God made this world for us, and he made it for us to look at, and he built us to understand it. So there's this part of science that is driven by, like, wow, God made this world and it's so beautiful, and I want to enjoy what he made for me to live in. Like, he made it for that. And the other piece that goes in that I think is very Christian is part of the basis of science. And it's funny because this actually goes to what Hazy and I were talking about earlier, like why we believe what we believe and bias and objectivity. Part of how science works is I come up with a theory in my head and then I tested it in reality. Why? Because what is in my head can be wrong and it doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And that's how science should be done. And that is a humble spirit. And that is a spirit that is like all the church fathers, all our Orthodox saints teach to approach things humbly like that. And if we actually did science like that, that's how, when science works its best. Like, that's when it does what it's supposed to do. Unfortunately, if you approach it with presuppositions and conclusions you want to arrive at, then obviously you're not even doing science, but you can still pretend it's science themed. Freud is actually a great example of this. There's a little video online. If you look up science versus pseudoscience on YouTube, it's probably one of the ones that pops up. It's like 8 minutes. But the basic premise of the video is that Einstein was a true scientist. Not that he was right or wrong, but just his methodology was real science. When he had a theory about light, he had this theory about how it would work. His first thing he did was to try and prove it wrong. He tried to prove his theory wrong. That's how you do science. You come up with something and then you bombard it. And if it survives, then it's more likely true. And if it's not, well, you're thankful that your bombarding destroyed it because you were protected from a lie. What Freud did,
yeah, I know.
Freud did the opposite. Yeah, he would come up with a theory and then he would look for cases that matched his theory. And that's pseudoscience. Like, that's the definition of pseudoscience, is finding the evidence to match your theory.
There's also a collection of letters from Freud where he would write his students and peers dismissals, where he would say, I no longer consider you guys as intellectuals like myself. Which is really weird to hear him, like, basically patting himself on the back, being like, I'm right, everyone's wrong. Whoever questions me is an idiot. I'm the only guy who knows what's going on. And funny enough, there's even Jung, where Jung was the first one to break the cycle and wrote him, what greater joy is there than for the disciple to overcome the master? And that was his final letter that Jung wrote him when he denied, like, the aspect of spirituality, or, like, not a hyper-materialistic approach.
Wow, I did not know about that. When I learned about the time Jung made Freud faint, because Freud was so upset by Jung's ideas that he fainted, I was like, that's some man-child energy there. But yeah, I do, despite Jung being deeply in the occult and having some things I would definitely disagree with, as someone whose favorite book of the Bible is Job, and love his prophet Job, Jung's little writing he wrote on the book of Job I found offensive. But I do like Jung a lot. I do think he understands a lot of things, but I think where the science part comes in, kind of what I was getting to too, is and this definitely ties back to the discussion from earlier. I mean, one thing I was talking about is humans only know what they experience, but they do experience some things that they can infer pieces from into another experience they haven't had. But when it comes to science and the fact that the ultimate practice of science is by having experiments, same root word, and that really actually ties together a lot of what I was talking about earlier. Like, if you think something is true, it doesn't matter. You have to go experiment. You have to go have an experience, something in the real world, not in your head. But the reality is that actually this was a really interesting conversation I was having with my priest one time. We were listening to my last priest, huge audiophile, big speakers in his living room. I would go over to his house sometime with my roommate and me, and my roommate, my priest, and his wife. Probably weird for Catholics when they hear priest's wife. But priest's wife would just sit on the couch, sip some wine, and listen to music. And we were having this discussion about Nirvana, who Father Andrew really likes, and he likes a couple other of the dark, grungy rock bands and whatever. And we were discussing, why he likes them, why we both like them and stuff. But we noticed, when bands, and this really applies to anyone, when they talk about something negative in the world, like, oh, this problem or that problem, or how we feel lonely, or it's like this, they always nail it. It's just like when the world's talking about bad things, they nail it. But then when they start singing about solutions, for an example, see John Lennon's song Imagine. Once they start imagining the solutions, that's where it gets really awful. And so going back to Jung and Freud and psychology, I think that's and even modern psychology, what I find I have to do is I can learn a lot from their data and from their observations, because they're looking at God's creation. They're looking at the same creation I am. So they can see that, the sky is blue and I see it's blue, that sort of thing. So a lot of times their value is that they have insight from an experiential perspective. But the problem is once they start guessing at the why. Freud, his is all about sexuality, and Jung is definitely, he's getting into the blank slate tabula rasa idea that is popular in some occultism. Because occultism and Luciferian ideas and what Christians would see as the most evil things in the universe, they're all about self. Everything that is about God, even God himself, is 3 in 1. He is communal, and each member of the Trinity lives for and loves the other 2 members. And likewise, this is what we're called to. So the antithesis of this humble love, this humility that says, hey, I'm not God, I need outside help from other people and from God, and this love that's live for other people, the inversion of this is pride and selfishness. I'm the best, I'm the most awesome, Freud. I'm the head here, and then everything is about me. Not only do I know everything, and I'm the guide and leader of everything, and I manipulate when I see the need, but everything is about me. Everything should serve me, compliment me, feed me, please me, etc. And so it's when you look at the occult and you look at some of the other movements that have overlap, one of the things they're all about is that we're a blank slate, that we can be anything we want to be and do anything we want to do. And this is very Luciferian. Lucifer is all about God puts this order on things and tells me what to do, and I want to be able to do anything I want to do. And so Jung suffers from this tremendously, unfortunately, and I think all psychologists do. I think the problem is that if you don't have at the top of your value hierarchy divine love, if it's not the love that we see at the cross, where Christ has had his enemies persecute him, torture him, spit on him, lie about him, all these horrible things. But not only that, his friend Judas betrayed him. Peter is denying him. People have left him. It's the worst thing that someone has gone through. And he looks at his enemies and he says, from the bottom of his heart, he says, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." That is actually like one of the most divine things that any human can encounter. Like we're doing ayahuasca and we're doing all these drugs and whatever, trying to find what's the divine in the fabric of the universe. And honestly, I think that's it right there. When you see in the Gospels the story of Christ truly praying that about his enemies, I see in him the thing I could never be on my own. And at the same time, I see the very destiny I was built for and the very spirit that birthed the universe. Like that spirit that would say to its enemies, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do, that all it can think about is the love of the person in front of them. That is the actual power that birthed the material world and everything in it from a Christian perspective. And so this is the danger of Jung and a lot of psychologists, unfortunately, is that despite their extreme insights, which I think people like us can totally filter through, if we have a good Christian foundation, we can filter through. Despite all that good stuff we can filter through, the lens they're ultimately going to interpret is always some kind of functional selfishness. And that to me is like how you could sum up the problem. It's worse than materialism. Like the materialism matches well with this. Certainly it enables the functional selfishness. Because if you're evolutionary and you're just designed to survive and be complex, I mean, that's selfishness, right? So the number one problem I'm going to have, especially from a spiritual perspective, is that unless you have an outside force that is love that you're going to call for help on, you're always going to be the crux of your theology or your psychology. Both as like the main character syndrome that Hazy talked about earlier, but also because it's the logical conclusion. Like what else are you going to find? If you just start looking at the world and how we all do this stuff because we want stuff, what else are you going to find except that, oh, look, we're all selfish and we're all supposed to be selfish. And all psychology is about how I want sex or I want to be a blank slate or I want to be whatever it is. So yeah, unfortunately, it always is going to come back to that. And I think the one other thought I'll say right at this moment is that I think the only way to actually sift it is, and I mentioned this a second ago, but to be rooted in the truth. It's like one of those little sayings that you find in motivational books and priests saying whatever. But if you want to if you work in a bank and they want to teach you to identify counterfeit money, they always will tell you, handle real money. Handling real money, handling the real deal, experience with the real thing is always the best way to recognize the false thing. So it will be our walk with Christ. It will be our participation in the divine services. It will be especially our familiarity with the spiritual life of the church fathers and their noetic spirituality. It will be all of these things that are part of our encounter with Christ, the sacraments, etc. These are actually the best lens by which a Christian could encounter these psychologists and come away benefited instead of harmed by them. So, yeah.
Hey, Hazy, you still there, man?
Absolutely, I'm still here.
Okay, just double checking. Yeah, like I said, my throat kind of hurts a lot, so sorry if I'm not speaking much.
No, apologies. I saw you guys were kind of having a conversation, a little bit of a back and forth. Essentially, it's the authentic thing that truly captures the essence of how to experience love, and obviously the myriad of other application fixtures can often help people and guide that path about how to deal with just life in general. I think that's a very apropos thing to go about. So I didn't mean to. Earlier on, you were discussing your own life and satisfactions with it. I think sometimes not having that, as you was describing it, like the lack of it or searching for it, sometimes the thought that you might not be grateful for what you do have, that unquestionable or the unquantifiable sorrow is something that definitely yearns for a greater aspect in your life. And God can be that for some people, absolutely, in terms of assignment. But one of the there's a myriad of things you also touched about that I genuinely to discuss, but perhaps at another time or even after the podcast has transpired. But in terms of therapy, really your particular specialties or skills, why did you most effective and worthwhile avenue to pursue? Because you told me earlier within the podcast that you became disaffected with just politics in general, but more ground roots elements, despite how small and a mediator they are, you found them to be the best and effective way to use your time. And on that subject matter, I just want to just draw a parallel that while people often talk about the grandiose natures of things like the presidency, your governancy, your local politics are going to be the things that affect your immediate vicinity. So while on a grandiose scale, you might believe that politics do not affect you, it is particularly due to the fact that you're probably not involved in your local politics. Similar effects to somebody doing something more grassroots around the particular neighbor's health and well-being. I just wanted to speak towards that just a little bit to not sound as though I'm downplaying what you're saying, but I just was intrigued by you deciding that avenue.
Yeah, I would on the well, I'll just jump right to your main question there. Yeah, and I probably better that you interrupted me. I think it would have been a whole second episode of a podcast anyways. But I hit a point where once I kind of had, I'm just skipping details here, but once I kind of had a model for myself of like why God would let us suffer. And it was something practical that I could use in my life. And I actually like this experience of, and I don't mean like I had like some specific mystical experience, but this long-term experience of healing, and that God showed up, and that these processes actually worked in my heart, how the ancient Christians understood when I guided my thought life and practiced prayer according to the strategies that they had, that have kind of been unfortunately lost in a lot of circles today. It was something that, first of all, it healed me. Like I stopped hating being alive. And second, I would talk about it all the time. And it wasn't just politics that I kind of like I had that moment where I was just like, I'm not going to be active in this anymore. And I worked for a state representative, and worked at the state capitol in Washington. I was pretty active in a lot of it, but I actually had a similar experience with psychology, because I realized that even though I didn't think psychology was bad, I think anyone that's like making psychology all good or all bad is kind of, well, it's just a little goofy. But I realized that my relationship with it, my heart's relationship, different than the outward legal utilitarian, but the inner, my heart's relationship to it was not healthy. Like I just was too attached to it. It provided too much of my meaning in my life, and I was thinking about it all the time. And I remember, like, as I'm starting to realize I want to become Orthodox, and I'm beginning that journey, I'm also realizing, Lord, I'm done with psychology. Like, if you want me to have it, you can bring it back, but I need to just be done with it. And it was about 3 or 4 years into being Orthodox that I had done, both before and after becoming Orthodox, a bunch of different jobs. I was a preschool teacher. I was a state legislator. I did door-to-door sales. I just did a bunch of different stuff. And I kind of hated all of it. I liked being a preschool teacher. That just didn't pay anything. That was the one problem with that job. It was just barely enough money to pay to rent out a tiny little room that I lived in. And so, and I tried to teach myself programming, which I like programming like as a subject, but once you have to write the same lines of code 100 times, I did not have the patience for it. So I was kind of stressed and worrying, like, okay, well, what do I do, Lord? There's got to be something. And I was talking to my priest, and he's like, well, I've overheard you have these like conversations with people at coffee hour, and some people have like talked to me about it. He's like, have you ever considered just like being a counselor or something? And I was like, well, I have, but I'm not, I don't have a master's. I have a 4-year undergrad, so I don't have a master's in counseling. I'm not a licensed counselor. And I told him, I said, I don't think I can do any more school. Like, I'm just not built for school. I'm a people person. I'm not academic. I can talk to people for hours, obviously. And like, it is hard for me to write a paper unless it's something I want to do and I'm in the mood for it. And even then I still can't get myself to write much. But anyways, he told me this and he encouraged me. He said, I think you should just make a website and make business cards. And I was like, okay, well, maybe. And then I went home to my parents and they were like, that's what we've been thinking. We've been thinking for a while that you should do this. This is all the strengths we've seen in you, like all these years. So you should just do it. I was like, okay. So I made a website. I made business cards. And my first clients were my friends, people that I was probably already talking to anyways, but they were like, yeah, like we'll meet with you. And they wrote me my first testimonials, because no one wants to come to some like self-proclaimed fake therapist for his first session. So I totally understand. So yeah, it started with my friends, and then it was just some random people on the internet that like found me and were talking with me and were like, wait, do you do this for a living? Like you can have like formal sessions? I was like, yeah, that's what I do. And so, yeah, that was about 4 or 5 years ago. So now I've got some actual experience under my belt and whatnot, but yeah, that's kind of how I got where I'm at. And I just meet with people I'm flexible. I think that's one of the best things I offer. It's just merely the fact that I'm flexible. And so like I'll meet with people at weird times, different hours. Some people I meet once a month as they want to schedule stuff. Some people I meet twice a week. I'm also a lot cheaper because I'm not licensed. So I charge people $40 to $60 an hour, and that's up to them based on their financial situation. But unfortunately, a lot of licensed counselors charge $80 to $120 to even more an hour, which they kind of got to do for licensing and if they have an office or whatever. But yeah, I keep all my operating expenses as cheap as possible. But I think the main strength I bring is one that what I've usually told is I'm good at explaining things, coming up with metaphors to make things simple and clear. And then beyond that, this is just, I mean, most people have like their subjects that click with them. This is mine. So yeah. Like I said, I've had bad experiences with not good religious therapists. So I think that's another thing I could bring to the table, is just the mere fact that I've had people do it wrong to me. So I'm much less likely to do those things to anybody else, thankfully. But yeah, I'm very explorative. And some people come to me and they think that they're maybe Protestant and they're looking at Orthodoxy. So they think that my coaching is all about like making them Orthodox, which it's not. I'm mostly there to walk with people who like to think and talk and explore stuff on subjects that usually are, I think some of us, I was someone, sorry, I'll sum it up this way. I was someone who was wrestling with problems that were as much psychological as they were philosophical and theological. And unfortunately, the people I was meeting who were therapists, they were only able to deal with the philosophy part. They had very little to say about theology and philosophy. And so I know that I really wish back then I had someone who could dabble in all of the subjects, because they were all linked for me. And so I think that's what a lot of the people that come to me need. There's someone who's like, I'm going to be talking a little bit about theology, a little bit about politics, a little bit about, like this one TV show we both watch that helps me explain it all to you. Heck, I had a client that came to me once, and like I think every single session Breaking Bad was referenced, just because there was like a handful of characters that summed up the experiences of the client that they were trying to explain to me, and thankfully I'd seen Breaking Bad. So yeah, it can vary. And the one other thing that comes to mind is I had a client who had been in a cult for years and had left it, gotten out of it. Like it was very high control, lots of shaming. It was a Christian themed group, but it was very not Christian. And this person had left the group and been gone away from it for a long time. And then they had worked for this one big corporation, and the corporation had all this weird stuff happen that kind of pointed to globalist politics. And so my client realized like, whoa, there's some weird stuff going on at this company. So they did research, and they basically got blackpilled on like the world and politics and everything, realizing like how much corruption there was. They had no idea. But this happens to a lot of people. There's a lot of people's story is they realized like if there's this much evil, there's got to be good in the world somewhere. And they started looking at religions. They realized they still very much believed Christ was the way. They started studying history. It led them to look at Orthodoxy. And now they were visiting this Orthodox church. But every once in a while, stuff in the church would trigger them because it was the same stuff they did in the cult. And so they were looking for someone who could talk through this with them, who knew about orthodoxy, was good at explaining things, and also knew about cults. And so I think it's a miracle. I think it was by the Lord's mercy, but by some chance they happened upon a YouTube channel that happened to be interviewing me, and I happened to mention these exact subjects, which this discussion is by far the most I ever talk about these subjects. I rarely mention like my love of cults and belief psychology. I'm usually on this therapy thing. But I happened to mention it in this episode. This person heard me and contacted me, and they were probably one of the most fulfilling clients I've ever had. Like, we met for about 2.5 years and we'd meet every other week for 2 hours, and they would just kind of like dump on me for the first hour, and then the second hour would be conversation. But it was an extremely fulfilling experience for me, because it was clear like their problem was like this exact niche problem that was right up my alley. I don't think I could, help the average person, because it's just they just need a different skill set that what I have as a coach / therapist. But if someone has those kinds of problems, I actually, what you would call it, there is somewhat of a term for it. It's existential therapy. When people have like therapy problems, but they're intermeshed with existential philosophical problems, it is a specific category of therapy, and there's not a lot of therapists that do it, because it's kind of like you have to be someone who's very psychologically minded and someone who's very philosophically minded. And there's some of those people, but even some of those that I know end up just being like a licensed counselor. So I do think the fact that I can offer this blend of existential and theological and psychological is probably the main reason that people come and meet with me. So yeah, that's the gist of it.
All right. I think that's very good, actually. I think a lot of people don't tend to realize how much someone who easily function with all conceivable capacities of life, because typically when we deal with philosophy, it's usually the practical perceptions of reality and how we should evaluate it. But then there's theologians who deal with the more spiritual facet of it, and then there's people who deal with political aspects of it, who typically talk about mainly how almost pointless or powerless people might feel the current political landscape due to politics, political motivation, or different political interests. I have a myriad of opinions about most of that, but in terms of that in particular, I was wondering, because we're getting to the close, we're settling down for a little bit for the podcast, as you've given them a plethora of things to think about and consider for this podcast. Is there any particular project writing you refer people to? And is there anything in particular they can look forward to on your channel? Since I do see you uploaded something almost a year ago, but is a potlucking sequel or anything like that? I digress. All jokes aside, is there any projects you're working on that will be available to the internet, or is there some place that people can reach you for some of the sessions you're providing as of now? Or are they all online, or are they all just in your media?
Yeah, so great questions. So first off, the YouTube channel that I think that you looked at is my old YouTube channel, which is the one that has the political speech that's linked on the blog post with the political speech. So there is my old channel, which has like old pop and lock dance videos, but I actually have a new channel. That's my main Orthodox coaching channel, just because I wanted to separate out like random dumb songs I uploaded and stuff. So if you go on YouTube and search Thaddeus Creative, I believe it will pop up as the first channel. And it has a picture of Elder Thaddeus, this old Serbian monk. So you'll know for sure that you found it. And that channel, probably every month or two, the main way I like to do videos is I like to give a talk that is like and you can kind of pick up on this from this discussion. I like to give a book level understanding, but I like to give it in like an hour. So I've had people are like, well, you do like hour videos, like why can't you do 8 minutes? And I'm like, well, I like to go deeper. I like to do something that takes an hour to talk about. But the thing is you're getting like a book level knowledge. So the main video I would recommend if someone is interested in this subject Probably my most popular one I've done is about orthodoxy and therapy. So that question, which I dabbled and danced around here, I have an hour, I think it's like an hour and 15-minute video that goes super deep into that. And it talks about the spiritual side, it talks about the psychological side, and it talks about the biological side, including like I had eating, I have food allergies that affect my mental health that I had no idea about for years. So I get into that there too, because I really value that holistic approach. And so that video's on there. I have a video about the Orthodox view of sin, which is a lot more nuanced than if you're used to like a Western view of sin. It will definitely be full of surprises if you want to understand a more ancient perspective. I have a lot of videos on there. And then recently I did actually upload a couple short ones. So there's a little bit of everything on there. So yeah, check out Thaddeus Creative on YouTube. And then my main website, which does have a link to that channel, is ThaddeusThought.com. And so if you go to ThaddeusThought.com, there is a tab for my coaching. So if you want to read more about that, if you're curious, people are welcome to just meet with me one time, see how it goes. And I think most people, almost everyone who's met with me, even just once, seem to have valued it. I've never had anyone that was like, oh, that was horrible. So we'll see. But I encourage people, if they're curious, just to meet with me once and see how it goes, see if they like it. So that's on ThaddeusThought.com. And there's also the political speeches on there under the blog section, as well as a couple other writings I have on there. But those are my main projects. And lastly, there is a contact me tab on ThaddeusThought.com. So if you have any questions about anything here, you just want to ask me some questions, whatever, I love just chatting with people, whatever. Don't feel like it has to be a coaching session or something. But yeah, feel free to go on ThaddeusThought.com, go to the contact page and get a hold of me that way. And we will keep in touch. So yeah, and I'll throw this out there too, my one other project. But with the caveat that I think it's actually not going to, at this point, it's not looking like it's going to happen, unfortunately. But in case it does, people will know what it is. I was starting a subscription men's coaching service with another Orthodox coach. And unfortunately, he's run into some stuff. He's got a family, and it might not happen. But if at some point you hear about the Rose Council, that's what the name is of the program. So I do think maybe at some point I might be involved in some other kind of men's program, because I think this is a good direction for me, but we will see. But yeah, the main things are basically my coaching program and also the YouTube channel. So yeah.
All right. Thank you. For this episode, I think we touched upon a myriad of subject matters. I think this is probably one of the particular episodes that I think we've gone to such extensive realms that there is something for everybody here. But I hope that the listeners at home really enjoyed this episode. As always, for your favorite schizo essay, I'm Hazy Dialects, and this All in H Solar is there.
Yeah, definitely gonna re-listen to this, to some of the portions I missed. It's really good to have you, Thad, and sorry I couldn't make the full thing, but I'd love to see you in like a part 2 if you're ever down that. We can talk about more stuff.
Yeah, I'd be back anytime. And definitely some good little topics to spin off of this one if we want.
No, definitely. That's all for me. Look forward to seeing y'all in the next episode.